morning, Richard. Great you're here.
How are you? Nice to see you. There we go. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, beautiful place. But we hope to have several more here. Yes. We have fun. Yes, if you're going to get it too. They seem happy. See them. They? that kind of thing. That, I mean, that, those kinds of things. You know, I can't, it's very hard to decent people try to get a job. So, I mean, that's every level. Everything. You know, things don't let the bad guys win. I know they're winning. No, they just lost the election. Just ask people to take their seats.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. If I can get you to take your seats, we're going to start in about 5 minutes.
Sit here, yeah, please, yeah. A few intros and then I'll call you up. So I think you go to University of Winnipeg and UBAM or?
So my undergrad economics, UBAM, but then administration
Yeah.
here, so it's practices. So it's working media for me, right?
Yeah.
There's a joint.
All right, all right.
right here, I put the agenda right here, so you've got the registration. Oh, sorry. Right here.
Yeah, it's underneath here.
Yeah, so then you've got right here. Then we've got our bio, like you, so 9:05, you're right on time.
Okay.
Okay? All right, thank you.
Friends, welcome. On this day and every day, we gather on the Creator's animally watery earth that so invites thanksgiving. And in gratitude, we gather on the lands of the First Nations of this place, Plains Cree, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Dakota Sioux, and this home of the Red River Métis. We are enabled by the drinking waters from the peoples of Shoal Lake, Treaty 3, and the hydroelectricity from the nations of Treaty 5. And here we may join in seeking reconciliation as we acknowledge our history of injustices and ongoing injustices that require us in good spirit to support the payments of debts owed and encouraging just negotiations of future relations, so enabling a good life together. And with this, our own troubled history with its centuries of disinformation and malinformation, perpetuated in our education, laws, economy, and culture, we already know something of the terrible costs of such falsehoods. Now, such poisonous seeds of discord and confusion are, of course, ever increasing and spreading in a firestorm, as you well know. A Cree elder recently counseled, "The situation is urgent. We must go slowly. And slowly we shall go this day, musing together over the burgeoning of dedicated disinformation, malinformation, targeting important building blocks of our society, of our life together. Notably, we gather in a time of widespread anxiety and fear about the well-being of the world itself, nearby and the far away nearby. There are fears over normalizing of the bombing and slaughter and starving of civilians. There are fears and nebulous dread about the future of watery animally earth, Sister Mother Earth herself. Deep fears about our society's fabric with its desperate need for living with respect, with pathways for participation and assurances of well-being. In this, our context of anxiety and many fears, advocacy groups advocating for measures intended to better enable our living together no longer only deal with people lacking information or people's indifference. We have added dedicated and targeted poisoning of the wells. Of course, advocacy requires our helping citizens deal with very particular matters of simple information, but now as well growing tasks of untangling quarter truths or sheer lies and other frustrations and outrages. These we know are on the rise. And is there not a further deep danger planted in all this? Is there not the growing of people's disabling sense that there is no such thing as truth at all? So creeping cynicism whispers, there is no such thing as truth, only falsehoods that haven't been discovered yet. And with this, you can never really get at the truth, can you? Is there not a growing sense of helplessness, a learned helplessness, with a shrug, if not a sneer, at the whole democratic process? A, for democracy itself, our democracy presupposes our ability, our willingness to participate in getting at the truth and at the tasks our society requires. This requires people's ability and willingness to participate in little and big ways. And it presupposes you advocates here seeking to facilitate this crucial part of our democracy. And indeed, our gathering here is such an exercise of participation. To close this opening, I must mention Tom Axworthy of Massey College of the University of Toronto and Colleen Sklar of John Q. Public, who hatched this notion of this gathering along with myself with the crucial help of President Cheryl Paul of the Canadian Mennonite University, Cheryl Matthews of Honest Agency, and Barbara Axworthy thankfully joined us in its crafting, so blame them. But first, I'm pleased to introduce President Cheryl Pauls of the Canadian Mennonite University to give a welcome.
Good morning and welcome all to Canadian Mennonite University, known to many simply as CMU. CMU is a learning community, a community that is honored by the invitation to connect with Massey College on the road, by the presence of this fine group of people who collectively have the wherewithal and the will to redirect tides of disinformation into trustworthy flows that generate true understandings, and by gifts of treaties, lands, waters, creatures, and kin of all sorts, to which Bob has so beautifully given expression. I've been asked to say a bit on this place, as it is new to some. CMU was entrusted with a public charter in 1998 by the province of Manitoba in a rather remarkable moment. Several Mennonite communities overcame their differences sufficiently to merge their colleges in a bigger vision. And if you can find ways to work together where slight divergences all but screech on the chalkboard, you can find ways to bridge much larger divides. At the same time, the province was looking for a buyer who would fix up that stunning building for education purposes. It was the School for the Deaf when built in the 1920s, and for most of the time until the 1990s, except for a 20-year window when it was the normal school, which is what they called it in the mid-20th century when you do teacher training. Also, it's good to know that Shaftesbury Boulevard out here in the late 19th century was named University Boulevard because it was seen to be the possible site for the University of Manitoba. When the Fort Garry location was chosen, that was changed. The primary mandate of this provincial act is to further the intellectual, spiritual, moral, physical, and social development and a community spirit among students, graduates, and staff for the betterment of society in ways rooted in the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition. That wonderful array of words in the act continues to set the tone for this well-established small university, which generally is in the 800 to 900 full-time equivalent size for all we do. And we've been able to move from our roots in theology, music, peace, and social economic development. These remain a heartbeat as we have extended to arts, humanities, sciences, social sciences, communications, media, business, social work, and more. This array of words also connects to this building name, Marpeck Commons, named for a 16th century person who was as much a civil magistrate as an engineer as an early Anabaptist church leader, a blend that inspires new combinations today. This array of words also connects to 4 commitments of all CMU education and scholarship. 1, educating for peace justice, which teaches all fields, including ones we invent and evolve over time. I'll reference only today a course in peace building and media, which allows not only for work that tries to distinguish truth from untruth, but attending to compelling a desire for what's worthy of trust and seeking justice in all we do. Learning through thinking and doing, which means we were so old-fashioned with service learning that we became ahead of the curve on work-integrated learning as that became more a movement recently. Generous hospitality, radical dialogue, and fourthly, modeling invitational community. To get out from under yourself. And today's student body, about 70% of our students have no prior connection with the term Mennonite. About 10 to 15% are international from 30 countries. 14% of our Manitoba students self-declare as First Nation, Métis, or Inuit. And of the 75% from Manitoba, these are evenly split Manitoba and Winnipeg and rural. Well, let's not call Winkler and Steinbach rural, but in that division they are. I trust that the gift of these entrustments will contribute to the quality of our learning together today. This is an honor to be with you and the renewal of collective trust for which we all yearn. Thank you, and I'm pleased now to turn the stage to Tom Axworthy, and thanks for this honor, Tom.
Well, good morning all. My name is Tom Axworthy, and I am Public Policy Chair at Massey College, University of Toronto. And I'm delighted this morning to announce that Massey College has, with our new principal, James Orbinski, decided to reach out beyond Toronto and Ontario, always a good thing, and to create a series of partnerships across the country with companion institutions to encourage debate around important public issues. And our first partnership is with Canadian Mennonite University today. And I hope it is the first of a deepening partnership with CMU. We hope, as well as the important topic today of social media disinformation, to also sponsor examinations of what is driving crime in the city, poverty, particularly in the North End, and other issues of tremendous concern across our community. So, very happy to be with you. Now, today's topic, disinformation and the future of democracy. I want to make just 3 brief points to frame the discussion before I introduce our first keynote speaker, the Honourable Matt Wiebe. And those 3 points are these. The first, when we look at when democracy was in the Western world first created in Athens in the 5th century, one of those conceptual breakthroughs, we should also realize that the first democracy killed Socrates. And why? Misinformation, rumor, accused of corrupting youth. The early Greeks in Athens knew about rumor. They knew about misinformation. They knew there was something in our human character that inclined us to think the worst. And so they even had in their pantheon a messenger from Zeus, Parthe, or Fama, she was later known, who had 1,000 tongues to spread the gossip and rumor. And so we have known misinformation as a problem in democracy right from the very first. We then get into our age, though, and my second point, what the Greeks had understood to almost be mythical, a goddess of rumor. We now know, through cognitive science and psychology, a lot more about how the brain works. And important theorists like Daniel Kahneman, thinking fast, thinking slow, or in popular parlance, we called it right brain and left brain operation. We know that the insights of the ancient Greeks have now been verified by science. That the way our brain operates in the right brain, or thinking one, according to Kaufman, we respond to emotion. We keep our old frameworks. We have intuition. And the second brain operation, which is logic, connecting the dots, he calls it thinking two, is harder. Brain has to work harder. It's slower. And therefore, the de facto position is thinking one, emotion, existing assumptions. It takes a lot more work to have thinking two, and therefore de facto, we always begin with the emotional response. So that ancient insight has been corroborated by 20th century science. So that then leads into, if we know there is always a danger that our emotions will succeed over our logic, the world we are in now, this tremendous technological change of the development of the World Wide Web, artificial intelligence, computing in a phone in my palm, where one can get all the insights of the Bodleian Library. This amazing conceptual breakthrough and the technological devices that can spread knowledge, inquiry around the globe in a few seconds. This wonderful invention. But we are human beings. Our species does not just take an untrammeled good. We tend to corrupt and misuse. And so we have, with these wonderful inventions of the 21st century, here's one going off now. We have what has been called the four horsemen of the social media apocalypse: Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and X. And we see to the use of these mechanisms that, let me just quote Tim Berners-Lee, a computer scientist who helped invent the World Wide Web. And unlike Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, he's a dedicated optimist and made his source code and his algorithms on inventing the web open source. Never made a profit over this amazing invention. But I saw him on video recently in a conference of the Monk School, and I was reminded, if any of you have seen the movie Oppenheimer, where Oppenheimer invented nuclear energy, the bomb, and then spent the rest of his life trying to put the nuclear genie back in the bottle. I was reminded of that image with Tim Berners-Lee, who on the anniversary of his invention of the World Wide Web said this, and I quote, he said this often, but this happens to be an op-ed in the New York Times: "I had hoped that 30 years from its creation, we would be using the web foremost for the purposes of serving humanity. However, the reality is much more complex. Communities are being ripped apart as prejudice, hate, and disinformation are peddled online. Scammers use the web to steal identities. Stalkers use it to harass and intimidate their victims. And bad actors subvert democracy using clever digital tactics." And we know from all the research that his cry of anguish is a real one. Some of the studies that we have done at Massey College have examined, for example, and we have some politicians with us in the room today, studies of tweets during election campaigns. The Samara Institute on Democracy has done a series of studies, and they found that 40% of the tweets were antagonistic and 16 to 18% were toxic, brutal attacks, personal attacks. And this is for the men and women who are putting their, spending time to make our democracies work, subjected to a torrent of disinformation and personal abuse. We know we've just come through a Canadian election campaign, and Mr. Carney, who had no previous experience in politics, the day he announced that he was going to be running for leadership of the Liberal Party, suddenly on the website emerged a new site saying Carney lies. With he'd been in politics about 2 hours at that point, with 80,000 followers. And the abuse continued with him, with an organization called Proud Canada, a terrible group, but who ran pictures of Carney when he was governor of the Bank of England in a social gathering with a woman who was acquainted with Epstein, the criminal, but he was just with her in a social gathering, but then ran ads on Facebook with big pictures of Epstein and big pictures of this, saying, "What does Mark Carney know about pedophilia?" And then all the followers on Facebook said, "Perv Carney," and X ran stories saying, "Was he visiting Epstein's island?" I mean, total, terrible lies. Not directly connected with the political party, but a third organization very closely associated with one party. Now, in this case, and to give us hope, the bad guys didn't win. They put out ads on Facebook. They had 2 million hits on these terrible assertions. But most Canadians intelligently didn't believe it. But that's what this conference is about. How do you identify the misinformation? How do you cope with it? How can you prevent it? So this is a topic important in Athens in 399 BC, critical in Winnipeg, Manitoba in May 2025. And so that leads very well into my introduction of our first keynoter, the Honourable Matt Wiebe. He's had a very distinguished career in Manitoba politics. He and I were talking that he also worked for Bill Blakeney, a dear friend of Bob Haverlick and myself, too soon departed. Bill and Bob and I were in youth parliament together in Manitoba. May have been the last election I won, actually, so it sticks very much in my memory. But with our new government in Manitoba, they have taken a leadership role based on reports of the Manitoba Electoral Commissioner and looked very closely at the issue of what one can do by regulation and law on the issues of disinformation, deep fakes, and artificial intelligence. He is championing Bill 30 as Manitoba tries to cope in our jurisdiction. I hope Mr. Carney will take what happened to him so that the federal government will also move on this issue. And we, in our small way at CMU and Massey College, can help through the area of public education. So we couldn't have a better start to this conference by introducing a man who is actually trying to do something about it. Matt Wiebe.
Morning, everyone. What an honor and a pleasure it is to be with you this morning. I wanted to start by, I'm looking for Bob here, thanking Bob for, there he is in the back, for starting us with your land acknowledgement, grounding us in an important way, and acknowledging the lands that we gather on, and I think also starting us off in a way that gives us the right amount of pause about the topic we're about to discuss here today, because it is an important one and there are some significant challenges. I also wanted to thank Tom for your invitation here today, and of course Dr. Pauls for your hospitality, welcoming us here to CMU, a place that I know is doing important work in many areas, but this connection is inspiring and very, very nice to see. As I said, I'm pleased to join you here today to talk about a topic that, as you all very well know, is so very critical in today's day and age. More and more, of course, our lives revolve around social media, revolve around the internet, revolve around the discourse that happens in those platforms. And that's whether we'd like them to or not. And I certainly skew towards the side that wishes it wasn't so prevalent in our lives. But we know that this is the reality that we live in. Everything from keeping up with family, with friends and coworkers, networking and job hunting, building businesses or promoting an event such as this one are all so much easier and so much more efficient when we're using social media and the internet as a tool. It's hard to imagine, quite frankly, getting much done in this world without the technology that we all rely on. As a politician, as a member of the Legislative Assembly, as a minister in government, of course, it is so vital that we employ social media and that we use its advantages in campaigning and communicating with our constituents. I spend a lot of time crafting social media messages to my constituents, telling them what I'm up to, telling them a little bit about myself in a personal way, communicating the things that are very important to me. And of course, we spend a lot of resources and effort communicating what the government is doing and what our key messages are. This is how we communicate with the people of Manitoba today. When people's attention is most squarely focused on politics during election time, it's absolutely vital. And Tom touched a little bit on the landscape that we now find ourselves in, where ultimately we're trying to give the best information we can to constituents, give them what our ideas are, what our platform is. But of course we know there are so many pitfalls as we do so. Social media is unavoidable in this modern age, and it's indispensable for the kind of effective political communication that we strive for. So while it's helpful in our daily lives, in business, and of course in politics, increasingly the internet and social media have become rampant with what the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity has termed MDM. That is misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And while misleading information has existed for centuries, as been highlighted already this morning, the advent of the internet and the social media landscape allows it to be disseminated at a scale and a speed that really has never been contemplated before. It's estimated that MDM costs the global economy billions of dollars every year. But just as important from our perspective is the damage that's being done to the public trust in our public institutions. You may have heard MDM referred to by other names, of course. Fake news is one that's used often. But whatever name it goes by, MDM has the power to influence public opinion, especially and including during our elections. It ultimately can be used as a tool to undermine the foundations of our democracy. So, what are disinformation and what are malinformation? We should clarify that. Unlike misinformation, where false information is spread perhaps unknowingly, disinformation is a carefully crafted campaign of propaganda. It's designed to serve a specific agenda, whether it be political, whether it be financial, or whether it be ideological. It has a purpose. Likewise, malinformation, which can manipulate the context of truth to intentionally misuse, has been used on social media in deliberate and often malicious manipulation of true facts that are now designed to deceive or mislead people or to influence public opinion. And so social media platforms have unfortunately become a fertile ground for these kinds of disinformation campaigns, allowing bad actors to spread false narratives at an unprecedented rate and scale. From fabricated news stories to deepfake videos, disinformation undermines trust in institutions, it fuels polarization, and it erodes democratic processes. The Guardian, in an article just published last week, states that more than 1/4 of Canadians have come across fake political content on social media, and that became, quote, more sophisticated and more politically polarizing as we neared Monday's federal election. This fake political content is filling the void left after Facebook's ban on Canadian news sources following the passage of C-18 that would require tech giants to pay news outlets for posting journalism on their platforms. Despite this ban on news, more than half of people in Canada claim to rely solely on the platform, on Facebook in this case, for their political news. Angus Bridgman of the Media Ecosystem Observatory, a research initiative out of McGill University, says that the news Canadians are accessing on Facebook is, quote, not the same quality of information they may have accessed before the ban. The richest, the most dense, and the most accurate and fact-checked information is just not making it through anymore. Neither is information that might contradict the views one holds as they access the platform. It appears that Facebook's decision to restrict Canadian news following the federal government's bill aimed to hold social media companies financially accountable to Canadian news media organizations is unfortunately exasperating the misinformation problem online. Bridgman describes Canada's online ecosystem in the wake of the ban in a New York Times article as in a continued spiral towards disinformation and division, and that Canadians are now more vulnerable to generative AI and to fake news websites due to it. Increasingly, disinformation campaigns have become more sophisticated and employed artificial intelligence and generative AI to manufacture and disseminate information that is so convincing, so real to people, these so-called deep fakes, that it's impossible for most of us, the average person, to distinguish a photo or a video from the real thing. Politicians, celebrities, athletes, business people, really any public-facing individuals are now at risk of having their likeness being used for an advertisement or a video campaign whose entire purpose is to spread this dis or misinformation. That is why in Manitoba, we're beginning to unpack these issues and taking action to start to address them. As the Minister of Justice, I was proud to introduce our legislation in this spring session called Bill 30. This is the Elections Financing Amendment and Elections Amendment Act, in which we specifically bar the use of deepfakes to influence or undermine confidence in an election. After what I think we can all agree was a divisive and inflammatory election campaign in 2023, and with the knowledge that technology had advanced, we knew that it was vital that we now put in these safeguards into law and start to protect the integrity of our elections and our election campaigns here in Manitoba. Deepfake advertisement and video campaigns are capable of undermining elections and therefore public confidence in the democratic process itself, and in my opinion, have no place, no role whatsoever in political campaigns. Now, this takes two forms of categories of MDM, of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Those which pertain to the electoral process itself, and those which pertain to the misrepresentation of another party or a candidate and their positions. With regards to the political or electoral process, the bill covers elements like disinformation about elections workers, about the time or locations that someone would vote at, false claims about the integrity of the voting process itself, questioning whether it is legitimate or not. These are generally, I think, self-evident. However, the challenge remains around the timeliness that Elections Manitoba, in this case, can take to correct the information that is spread more broadly. But we've also expanded the sections of the Act which makes false statements about a candidate's character, an offense, further clarifying the types of false statements that are prohibited, including, for instance, claims on place of birth, on education, on citizenship, and including disseminating or publishing that false information. These are all elements that we know have become factors in other jurisdictions. I don't think I need to to put a finer point on that. We've seen where this road leads. And by identifying now, early in the process, and specifically naming these particular issues in our legislation, we can begin to give the tools to our election officials to begin to stamp those issues out. Our bill also gives tools to party members and to voters themselves by enabling them to hold politicians accountable, by requiring parties to establish a code of conduct that includes a complaint procedure for advertising. We think this is a common sense measure. It forces parties to be more accountable, to develop these policies and then be held accountable for them, but still preserves the democratic input of voters. Parties can be held accountable based both on the policies that they develop and then how they hold their candidates to those standards. It's a balance that we believe gives voters the important agency in the process that will continue to build further trust in the system. Overall, the bill preserves the culture of robust and free the robust debate and free exchange of ideas that we expect in our democratic system. But it also provides Elections Manitoba with new tools to rapidly address advancing technology that is used by bad actors to deceive people. These are changes that, along with other changes made to enhance and broaden the ability and accessibility for Manitobans to vote, we believe will continue to build and enhance trust in our public institutions. All of these changes, I should note, have come from the recommendations, as Tom mentioned, made by Elections Manitoba themselves on how we can improve our elections process and how we can rebuild that trust. We're listening to the experts, we're working with them, and we're acting on their advice in order to strengthen our democracy. This isn't a partisan issue. This is one that all Manitobans can come and be a part of. Now, as I say that, I should note that the bill has been delayed in the legislature. The opposition has chosen to delay this bill. That being said, this gives, I think, Manitobans more opportunity to debate, to discuss, to have opportunities like we're seeing here today, to discuss these important issues. Hopefully strengthen and continue to support the bill, and we will pass this bill before the next election. These will be the rules that we continue to build our democracy through. You know, I'm a father of two young children who are now, well, I guess in the next couple weeks they'll both be teenagers, so very young teenagers. And I have to admit, it's a scary time. It's a scary prospect seeing them grow in the world and navigating some of the challenges that we're talking about here today. Knowing that they're being exposed to this type of willful deception in their online lives and the potential damage that can flow from this information that they are exposed to. But I want to be clear, it's not just our kids, it's not just young people who are affected by this. I think everyone in this room can admit that they probably spend entirely too much time glued to their phones every single day. And so everyone is vulnerable here. It's going to take a whole new level of media literacy that all of us need to be a part of in order to combat the kind of MDM that we're talking about here in the political discourse. So with the knowledge that misinformation and disinformation are ubiquitous in our online ecosystem, how do we learn? How do we teach our children? How do we help others to learn? And how do I identify false or misleading information online? Again, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity has a guide to help us all when online to understand and to identify this false information and the onslaught that we continue to see every day. They recommend asking yourself the following questions when viewing content. First, does the content provoke an emotional response? Does it make a bold statement on a controversial issue? Is it an extraordinary claim, or does it contain clickbait? Does it use small pieces of valid information that are exaggerated or distorted? And has it spread virally unvetted or in loosely vetted platforms? These questions are all important, and they can help us to identify misinformation, but the truth is that if the answer is yes to any of these questions, it still doesn't mean that it's automatically mis or disinformation. It means instead that the information should be investigated more thoroughly, that all claims posted online can easily be verified by doing the kind of research that checks sources, cross-references that information with information posted on trusted news and government websites. And of course, that, I believe, is what we all should be doing and what we should be teaching and encouraging others to do, especially our children, including our parents, for some in the crowd here today, and for our friends, for everyone that we associate with. That's how we combat this kind of disinformation. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity has also provided a list of things we can do to take action against disinformation. They include things like using these fact-checking websites, which have sort of streamlined the process to search for the content that we've seen online, verifying that the domain names are correct, that they're spelled correctly, that checking organizations for their contact information for a tie to a physical address. Another suggestion is that we do not assume that the information we receive directly, even sometimes from family or friends, is correct. We have to be vigilant, and we have to always use our critical thinking when encountering new information. The internet may be rife with misinformation, but when used correctly, it is a hugely valuable resource to conduct research and fact-check things that we see and hear every single day. Media literacy and media training and education is hugely important, and it will enable individuals, and especially our children, the next generation, to correctly and properly identify mis and disinformation on the internet and in other circles, including even on the playground or in the classroom. This type of education Ultimately, we'll equip our children and our youth with the skills to become the kinds of adults who are not only able to recognize and denounce false and damaging information, but also to educate and correct their peers, their family, and their friends about the more harmful content that they consume. But we should be clear about the challenge we're facing here. With AI being more integrated into everything from basic search to the algorithms that power our feeds, and all kinds of information aggregation that's fed to us every single day, people are increasingly farming out their critical thinking skills to confidently incorrect AI. Individual researchers and fact-checking, it's just not part of the toolkit that many new internet users have. And let's face it, the rest of us can easily be complicit with the easy answers that AI provides us. So there needs to be more than just education, just a concerted effort to teach the next generation about the harms of disinformation. We need to bring together the public discourse around holding accountable the companies that are pervasive in spreading this and misinformation. The platforms themselves, the social media companies, need to be held accountable for the falsities that have been posted on their platforms. And when many of these companies refuse to be held accountable, even when misinformation and disinformation content has resulted in injury or death, we need to go further, and we need to pass legislation that requires these companies to take the kind of actions that Canadians want to see. And this is where I believe a national approach will be key. Federally, we've seen some progress in this regard. The bill, Federal Bill C-63, also known as the Online Harms Act, first introduced way back in 2021 as C-36. It died on the order paper in just this past session in January at the prorogation of Parliament. The bill, which was modeled after the UK Online Safety Act of 2023, introduced amendments to the Criminal Code as well as to the Canadian Human Rights Act, and was designed to enhance regulatory scrutiny surrounding specific types of harmful online content. This bill proposes establishing a general framework that compels platforms to assess the risk posed by harmful content on their services, and it ultimately incentivizes platforms to manage the risk when developing their products. The bill specifically addresses such activities as fomenting hatred, inciting violence, extremism, and terrorism, sexual victimization, sharing of intimate images, and inducing self-harm, among others. However, an advisory group recommended the categories of harms targeted should be expanded to include misleading political communications and misleading propaganda. Now, it's unknown, of course, if the new government will reintroduce the bill, but it has been generally well received, and it's been seen as one step in the right direction for internet safety, with the ultimate goal of protecting our children and protecting those who are vulnerable online. And I believe that this is the kind of national conversation that we need to undertake, supported by the provinces like we are in Manitoba, to continue to address these issues and develop policies to deal with them. When originally introducing the bill, then Federal Justice Minister David Lametti commented that the internet has become the new public square. That is, it's replaced the physical town square where people once gathered, where they once posted and recited information and opinions. If the online world is our new public square, then we have a responsibility to ensure that we educate our children and others in critical thinking, in how to research, how to fact check, and to think about the things that we see and hear every day, whether it be online, in television, or on the radio. And at a time when journalistic integrity is perhaps most in peril, controlled by a very small group of super wealthy individuals, media literacy is now one of the most effective tools that we have to fight back. Artificial intelligence is becoming more and more powerful every day, and this tool in the hands of those who wish to misinform is a frightening prospect. Legislation like Bill 63 will continue to help us fight back against that step. But we're not powerless, as I've said, in the face of these developments. We can and we must hold tech giants accountable when they fail to act as good corporate citizens. We must continue to address misinformation and disinformation on their platforms. And here in Manitoba, for our part, we'll continue to take steps to build trust and enhance our elections, to ensure that they are fair and that they are free, and to protect the candidates who wish to participate in the democratic process from these false accusations. Our government's introduction of Bill 30 highlights our commitment to doing exactly that and offers some concrete steps, as I said, in the right direction. Ethical campaigning is paramount in a free and fair democracy, and we must actively fight against any disinformation and bad faith attacks that are laid against candidates, elections workers, or any other groups. We cannot take our democracy for granted, and that's why we're all here today, to begin to unpack and work on these issues together. I know that we will continue that work. We'll continue to protect our democracy against these new and evolving threats, and I thank you for the opportunity to say a few words, and I'm happy to take any questions from the floor as we wrap up. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the minister has said he will take any questions, so please fire away, everyone. That's any. Start off.
I told my former professor, Paul Thomas, that he's not allowed to ask me any tough questions because...
Question. Could you just go to the mic because we are live streaming? Yeah, thanks.
On?
There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. You had said we need to teach the next generation about the harms and how to think critically. Don't we have to teach all of us?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's a good point, and I think in my comments, I hope I highlighted the fact that what we're seeing, first of all, is twofold. For the next generation, the kinds of critical thinking skills that many of us take for granted when navigating the internet or any information, quite frankly, is ingrained. It's something that we've learned over a lifetime, and we sometimes, as I said, get complacent, characterize it as being lazy, right? The answer is right there at the top of Google now, and it told you what the answer was, so that's got to be the answer. It certainly can, we can all fall into that trap. But again, I think the kind of critical thinking that's been developed as many of us have grown up with the internet or lived in this space for a number of years, those kinds of skills we already have. We need to build on them, we need to enhance them, and we need to make sure that everybody is appreciating the landscape that they're navigating. But for the new generation, they don't have that base. They don't have that foundation of critical thinking that so many of us take for granted. And when they do see something, either fed to them through their social media feed, again, an answer that's provided to them by AI in a search result, in many cases, they're not giving it that critical thinking second look. And so I think there is a specific imperative for us to give those tools. You know, when I was a kid, going through school, we had, an understanding of advertising and the way that advertisers use tools to influence the decision-making. We saw a commercial on TV and, you learn in school, well, they're just trying to sell you something, and your parents would sort of reinforce that, and you'd understand the landscape that you're navigating. In today's world, this is happening at just an absolutely exponential rate, and yet I don't think we're doing a good enough job of teaching our young people what the motivation is and the tools that are being used by these online platforms to influence their decision-making. So I think that we have an imperative to give additional tools to young people, and that kind of critical thinking work needs to, or toolkit needs to be provided for them, but for all of us. And I also mentioned, older people, my parents' age, I get a forward from my dad off of Facebook. Well, Dad, that's maybe not true. You should check that out. This happens all the time, right? I think it's behooves us all to ensure that we're using those critical thinking skills all the time.
I'm curious about the enforcement mechanisms under Bill 30. So you talked about a lot of provisions kind of trying to mitigate the misinformation, maybe holding people to account. You talked about the federal level and the accountability for social media companies, but at the provincial level, like, is it prosecution of individuals, or what does the enforcement look like?
Well, so there's two elements to this. As I said, what we're proposing is that there is a policy developed by political parties. So first of all, there's some way to hold them accountable for the information that they put out. The parties, of course, will be held accountable by the public as to what those policies, whether they're robust and whether they're thorough to the standards that they would expect, and then whether they're being adhered to. Any kind of policing of that would happen by the electorate, by the parties themselves, and then they'd be held accountable by the electorate. The other element that you're talking about, I think, is with regards to the election integrity itself. And this, again, flows directly from recommendations from Elections Manitoba. And how do we hold people accountable for that information? And how do we do it in a way that's timely? Because we know that information spreads so quickly. It can, something can be posted, it can become a reality in such a quick period of time. Elections Manitoba has, this is new ground. We are literally at the forefront across the country with regards to developing and implementing this upcoming election, 2027. I should know that, 2027. It will be the first test of this. They've assured us that they have the ability to move rapidly and to hold people accountable, in this case, bad actors. But this will be a test. This will have never been done before, and especially not done in real time. And so we do have some penalties within the bill, but it will be ultimately, I think, as I said, the timeliness that will be the most important element of this, because once an idea is put out there, once it spreads, the genie's out of the bottle, the cat's out of the bag, right? So. I think David.
Yeah. Hi there. Thank you for speaking with us today. This has have been a fascinating talk. I'm very fascinated by Bill 30 that you're proposing, and I guess my question is, it's very painfully clear to me that this is a bipartisan issue, and everybody should recognize that. But at a time where party polarization is at an all-time high, I wonder if you could speak to how we can bring attention to that and bring unity to that perspective.
Well, I was sort of just talking through the process with Paul before the talk here. In our legislative process at the Manitoba level, we have, the opposition has the ability to hold up a few bills every session, and this is one that they chose to hold up, and I won't speculate on why or what the motivations were or to make any comment there. What I would say is that does give us extra time. It does give us time to have these kinds of conversations and debates. Specifically in the Manitoba legislature, there's a new party leader in the opposition benches, and I think it gives them an opportunity to come out clearly about where they stand on this issue more broadly, and to help educate folks about the need for this. This really is something that came from the experts, and there's a lot of opportunity for for us to build off of this as we go into the next election, supporting Elections Manitoba and informing people and letting them know what the impacts of this bill will be. In Manitoba, we have every bill that we bring forward comes to a public committee, and so I hope that there's some robust debate. Some of you may want to weigh in at that committee and lend your voice. But again, I think this gives us just more opportunity to get the word out, to talk about this important legislation, and to talk about it in a way that, doesn't divide people, it doesn't create wedges, but simply, helps people understand why this is important. And by no means are we saying that this is, the be-all, end-all, that we've got this right, and now, we've dealt with the misinformation and disinformation in Manitoba. There's still lots of work that needs to be done, and as this evolves, we need to make sure we're keeping up with it. So I think the conversation, while it's important now, will continue to be important into the future, and that's why I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about it here, and hope that the conversation is really, that the message is received by all Manitobans. Marilyn?
Hi there. Thank you very much, Minister, for your comments this morning, and I commend you on the bill that you're proposing, or that's working its way through. It strikes me as a particularly wicked problem in that it's urgent, important, and complex, so I commend you for taking that on. It's starting. It's good. I would like to ask you to think about something that's a little more future-oriented, and you brought it up, the issue of AI and its overlap with this issue. While you were talking, I picked up my phone and I thought, he probably thinks I'm texting my mom and not listening. What I was doing is I was asking ChatGPT, will you help me craft a misinformation campaign?
Yeah.
And it said,
Yeah.
no, we don't do that. And I said, okay, like, what don't you do? And it said, here's the 8 categories of things we will not help with. And I went, okay, how do you know? One of them was misleading misinformation campaigns. And I said, how do you know I'm doing that? And they said, well, we have a bunch of policies that OpenAI, which is the company that owns ChatGPT, that have crafted. And I'm like, who sets those policies? Well, it's the board of directors of OpenAI. And so I was wondering, you as a representative of a provincial government, particularly a Minister of Justice, and your colleagues maybe at the federal level, what do you see as your limitations and also your challenges and your opportunities to deal with that issue? And can you describe for us how the government is currently seeing, your challenges there?
Well, there's a lot there, and it is sobering to hear, the kind of the framing of the question in that way. It just occurs to me, you asked ChatGPT that. ChatGPT is I think a publicly traded company, big American investors. DeepSeek, or another Chinese AI platform, which we're seeing more and more being used. Who sits on that board of directors? Who's controlling or dictating the ethics that they adhere to? So I think you've really hit the nail on the head of the scope of the challenge that we're facing and sort of what's in front of us. That's why I do believe that, while I don't want to diminish the work that we're doing here in Manitoba, because I think that we're not going to sit on our hands. We're not going to stop moving our feet with regards to how we can have an impact. We do believe that this is a national issue, and one that I think all of us need to come together around. And around the conversation around the federal bill that I heard, there were parts that folks, maybe, as you said, maybe not going far enough or aren't really truly capturing the issue. Some folks thought it was going too far in some cases. That's okay. It's okay to have disagreements about this kind of challenge, because none of us have the one answer that's going to solve it. But I do think that there is an ability within the overall Canadian framework with the CRTC that we have the ability to, manage the information that comes in or that's accessible to Canadians. And, this sounds like a far-reaching step, but I think that's where we're at. Now, there are some actors that we can work with. We can, maybe there's a way to figure this out with Facebook or with, Twitter, Elon Musk, but maybe. But I do think that there is a limit to this, and there has to be some accountability from these online platforms. If they're not willing to meet those obligations at the federal, in terms of policy set at the national level, then maybe they're not allowed to operate within our country. And I think that's the stage that we're at. So we're looking for partners, again, across the country in this, and we're going to continue to take the small steps or the pieces around the edges that impact average Manitobans every day. When it comes to the election, we hope that this will make a real difference. We'll stamp out some of this stuff that we anticipate coming. But for the larger online discourse, I think you're right. This is a wicked problem, and one that, as you said, we need to act quickly on.
Minister, just one last question, if I can ask
Please,
you
Tom.
this.
Yeah.
I should also mention, both to our audience and the online audience, that Massey College, David Shabatov, has written a background paper, very extensive, on comparative best practices, which we can make, it's on the Massey website, and we can make available to all those who registered for the conference. But I wanted to ask, because you had mentioned it in your remarks, a good part of David's paper is on education, and particularly looking at Estonia, Sweden, and other Nordic countries which have integrated digital literacy right into the educational system. Now, you're not Minister of Education, but is this something that a comprehensive approach to this seminal problem, to look at whether, and teachers, new curriculum with teachers I know is so difficult, but whether this can become an important focus for the young people looking at what other countries have done to improve their citizens' knowledge about this, particularly the young?
Well, it's a very good question and a very good point, Tom. And you're right, I'm not the Minister of Education, so I'm not up to speed on what other countries have done or some other models. What I do know is that within our government, it's a live conversation around the table. Folks may know, may have heard, if you've got kids, you definitely hear about this. We banned cell phones in schools. And yeah, I see some applause back there. I join you in that. I think it was a step in the right direction. But let's not kid ourselves. Of course, our young people are accessing digital media and having these conversations online. And as I said earlier, I think that there has always, or maybe there hasn't always been, but there has certainly been over the last 50 years a concerted effort around media literacy and understanding the sort of tools that are used. When it comes to advertising, when it comes to information, even, information from, news outlets, Fox News or others. Canadians have a pretty good understanding of that, and I think a lot of us grew up with that as part of the education system, and I'd credit that as a big part of the reason why we have those tools. So as we move into this new landscape, I think this is where it's going to be absolutely key that we're not sugarcoating this in any way for the next generation. These are incredibly powerful tools, and as I said, all of us are guilty of spending a lot of time with this thing 8 inches from our nose, and so for young people, it's going to be an important part of their education, understanding what the impacts are, what those tools are, and how they're being used. What are the motivations behind those tools? And I'd say that it's a daunting task to understand how we can give them the proper tools, especially as this evolves in such a quick manner. But I think that it's vital to begin and to try, and so that's going to be one of the things that we're going to be talking about a lot in the next few years, I can suggest.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you very
Ladies and
much.
gentlemen, we'd like to thank the minister for this.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it very much. Great opportunity. Thank you.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we'll break for coffee and a bun and come back when we have a panel which will get into these issues in great depth. But an excellent start, and thank you very much. Have a coffee. You should meet the minister. Push yourself forward, David.
This thing, I think Colleen wants me sitting here. Well, we're just gonna. So Colleen, just wait, am I standing as moderator with 4 people sitting?
Yes.
Okay, then you don't need to move
But
it.
we could
No,
also.
no. What it was if I have to hold that, I'm
Oh,
screwed.
yeah, no.
So if I can stand.
So I was thinking you stand and then just kind of moderate. How are you? Do you want us to move you?
Yeah, that might feel more
Like,
Yeah,
comfortable,
it
right?
feels, so that
the
I'm,
conversation can be had. Just that camera is the main one, so I don't want to lose your face. But
will the camera block the person who's sitting here?
well, that's the only thing. Yeah, that's a good question.
Like, it feels like this is right in their face for the person who's sitting here.
Or just move them down.
Because that would be way better. Yeah.
Just a little. Like, it would be
One more chair instead. And we move the podium down.
absolutely.
And then Marilyn maybe could sit here
Yeah.
with the microphone and then you won't have to hold it.
Oh, that might be nice too, eh?
Because I have trouble holding.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the microphone we'll pass around to guests. It's not on right now.
Okay.
Will there be an introduction from Tom into this segment?
Yes, he's going to introduce Marilyn.
You know what we'll have him do is I'll have him use the handheld wireless.
And then just
Okay.
hand it to. But are you can't. You don't want to hold the handheld.
No,
but-
I don't want to hold the hand out. So
No.
I just want that in front
Yeah.
of my face.
I'll go talk to him.
Yeah.
was gonna come help you. Do you think, we can move this so Marilyn doesn't?
Absolutely, 100%.
There we go.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Because if I have to hold papers and a mic and stuff, that's beyond my.
This is great. So ideally, you do want. Can you just sit down for me, just so we can set this so it's perfect? Because we do want the microphone facing right into your mouth for best clarity.
Is that okay there? Yep. Okay. So I don't have to lean for. I don't have to lean forward. No. Okay.
I mean, if you
Sure. It needs to be open for me already if I'm going to do this.
start speaking to the guests, you might use your budget. So it's not this.
Okay. That'll be okay? Because you could put it sideways, like from here, right in front, if that's better. Sure. There we go. Thanks.
Just want you to be able to get out of here. You need to.
Right across if that's what you, I don't mind, like I can.
Nice to meet you. Yeah. Yeah. And
Are you okay there? And you told her Marilyn here, right? Marilyn is, she's actually, she's a director. More importantly, Marilyn is an IGC commissioner. She actually sits on the International Joint Commission. No, you're trying to get. I'm sorry. I had to tell you.
it's okay.
good topic, really. Yeah, no. Yep, yep, sorry.
No, I just know more so just like.
Yeah, I'm gonna call in as we go. That's one of the organizations.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you could come back and take your seats, we'll begin with our next panel in a minute. Whistle and get back into your seats.
What did you do with them?
place for me? Do you want to put me in your?
I'm gonna put you in your place. Any seat, like, we're gonna put Marilyn here with that microphone.
Okay, and then we're going to pass the microphone
Yeah, we're
around?
gonna pass around, so maybe if you wanna sit by Marilyn, would be great. And Hazel, if you wanna grab a spot, maybe by Paul. Oh, yeah. Can't remember the order, I think it's, doesn't really matter.
Doesn't matter.
No.
Maryland.
Sure. Is that okay, Laren? And then we have Rochelle coming right now.
They're at the back.
Yeah.
We have the best Paul Collins.
Marilyn, you're on. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we move into our panel, I've got the delightful pleasure of introducing Marilyn Fair, the moderator for our panel, to continue the discussion. She is a very valued colleague of mine. We've worked together for many years on the water issue. She's a two-time commissioner of the International Joint Commission, and also tremendously knowledgeable as the director or president of SEER, one of the leading think tanks, and to work on Indigenous collaboration and working with Indigenous Canadians to ensure that they have an imprint on our life and legislation. So she's a real gem in Winnipeg, and I'm delighted that she's with us to moderate this panel.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that kind introduction. And good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here today. It's lovely to see you and the level of interest on one of the most urgent and complex, as I said earlier, wicked problems of our time, misinformation and disinformation. As you heard from a number of the speakers this morning, we are living in a moment where information is more accessible than ever, but coming along with that is obviously falsehood. And our focus is on how do we identify this and how do we manage it. It's such a big problem. It's a global phenomenon, but it also has very local, very real consequences for our lives here today in our location. In Manitoba, we have seen this and we've experienced it, how disinformation can erode trust and fuel division in communities, online and offline. These issues don't just live on the internet, they translate into our communities and into our schools and our hospitals and our governments. They impact, as you heard the minister say, and Tom also say, our very democracy and have done so for a long time. It doesn't just come from a few bad actors or bots. It comes from many sources: overwhelmed news readers, underfunded local journalism, polarizing social media algorithms, and a growing sense of disconnection. But we are not powerless, which is why this session was organized today. Across disciplines like journalism, education, public policy, technology, and community engagement, there are people who are doing things, who are pushing back, and you are lucky to be able to listen to 4 of them here today. These are 4 people who have deep expertise in thinking about these issues or have experienced them directly. They have lived experience trying to manage their way through misinformation and disinformation campaigns that have affected them and the work they're trying to do. So we're going to try to explore that problem with them. We are going to hope to learn about their experience and then also hopefully take away some strategies for resilience, some strategies for combating some of this. How can we equip the public to recognize and reject falsehoods? Maybe how have you done that? How can we rebuild trust in our institutions and our processes? What can be done at the local level? Does that sound like something you want to take on? Okay. All in 45 minutes. So I'd like to start. I'm not going to introduce you. I'm going to ask you for the first question to introduce yourself. Maybe explain to the people your role to this point, give them a sense of who you are, where you come from, and I would like to ask in particular, so I'll ask each of you those first two things, but we'll start with Paul. And I'd like to know, in addition to that, if you could just comment a little bit at the highest level, because I know you've been a commentator on government and policy things for a very long time. Is this an issue that relates specifically to any one level of government or any one political viewpoint? If you could give your thoughts on that after introducing yourself.
Okay, introducing myself. Brings to mind the Ag Center in Brandon a decade or two ago. I've been involved with the Rural Leadership Training Program, designed it and delivered it for 20 years. The young lady introducing me they said, our speaker this morning deserves no introduction. I think she meant need, but the audience went along with the idea that I wasn't deserving. I'm a professor emeritus of political studies. It's a fancy title. I taught for 40 years at the University of Manitoba, the last 10 as the Duff Roblin Professor of Government. And on this particular topic, my claim to some credibility is 6 years of service on the Elections Canada Advisory Board. So elections are one highly sensitive area of communication. It's the one form of participation that most citizens engage in. The rest of the time, we're mostly spectators. So I was granted 5 minutes opening, so I got to go fast. I have 5 points. I don't know whether a mature person like me can do that in 5 minutes, but I'll try. My first point is it's a cultural issue, what we're coping with here. Democratic politics will not be healthy and function effectively without a substantial amount of honesty, truthfulness, self-restraint, transparency, and trustworthiness. Trust, of all those democratic values, trust is the most important. And if we don't have a crisis of trust, we at least have a serious trust deficit towards all institutions, but particularly towards politicians and political parties and governments. Second point, we have a challenge, a deep fundamental challenge about how we protect free speech and rigorous debate while limiting the spread of false and misleading information. And that's going to require a careful, balanced, integrated approach. Thirdly, changing technology and changing practices of political communication are creating a torrent of information coming at people that is extremely difficult to deal with. There's a justifiable concern that the potential for misleading and harmful online information will unduly affect election outcomes. And yet, on the other hand, we want robust debate and so on. And I'll say a word in a moment about so-called deep fakes of harmful images in video form, in text, and online. So I've just written a long paper, and if anyone's suffering from insomnia, you're entitled to a copy of it. I'll just get in touch with me. I'm to be found somewhere on the internet. I'm not sure where. But across all jurisdictions around the world now, but particularly in the United States, a flurry of deep fake laws. Everybody's trying to come to terms with the challenges of this. Manitoba is a relatively small jurisdiction in the middle of the country, and we're not immune from some sinister forces at work. But I don't know to what extent we're vulnerable, exposed and vulnerable to some of these trends that are going on elsewhere. We have certainly had a rise of negative advertising, hard-hitting attack ads that are terrible in their content, most recently in the 2023 election. It was horrendous what the Conservative Party of Manitoba, the Progressive Conservative Party, put up online and on billboards and the rest of it. But the bill that the minister just spoke about, Bill 30, with the long title, was meant to be anticipatory and preventative. You'll never get it right on the first try with one piece of legislation. And that's why the bill had to balance detail and flexibility, allow for regulations which are more easily changed than going back to the legislature and amending legislation. And as the minister mentioned, the bill seeks, well, at first, it's a bill of many, many parts. And I could keep you here overnight talking to you about it because I've read it in deep detail. You see, I still don't have a life being retired, but there are two main focus. One is on the integrity of the election process because people engage in mischievous actions or damaging actions like directing people to the wrong polls through robocalls or things like that. And then the other side of it has to do with online information and also in traditional media as well. So one part of it is the development of an advertising code. The minister didn't give us full information on that. I did a piece in the Free Press a while back pointing out that since 2000, after a rigged election scandal, there's a code of conduct adopted for political parties in Manitoba. It's been around since 2000. Go on the websites of the parties and try and find out what mention there is of it. It's only found now on the NDP side, and it wasn't there until a year or so ago. And that was supposed to make a commitment to not engaging in misleading or scandalous information about the character or behavior of people. So they haven't implemented it, but they're going back to the same principle on an advertising code and say the parties will enforce it themselves. They'll develop it. There's no requirement to create a complaint procedure that's publicly available. It'll all be based on internal complaint mechanism. If I had my way, there'd be an integrity commissioner of some kind for each of the parties who'd be an outside person like a retired judge or something that people could identify as a figure to go to. The second point is that the requirement on deep fakes is that the election commissioner, who's part of Elections Manitoba, but is a part-time downtown lawyer who does this other job on the side, he comes into action only in response to complaints. I don't know how he'll deal with this much broader mandate he's now got to view the whole mediascape, the whole ecosystem, and deal with potential misleading or disinformation and so on. He'll have to have staff. He may have to hire an analytical team to monitor. I just don't know how he's doing it. He can issue. I'll stop at this point. He can issue stop orders. And that has to be done within 24 hours at a maximum. But a lot of bad things can happen when a video goes viral within 24 hours and gets reposted and so on. He can impose fines up to $20,000 a day. So we'll have to see how that works out. There's much more to be said about the bill, but I'll stop there. I've taken more than my fair share of time.
You're lucky I don't wear a watch anymore. Thank you, Paul. Hazel, if you want to actually, so your role, who you are, some of your experience. Thanks.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. I'm Hazel Borys, Director of Planning, Property, and Development for the City of Winnipeg for the last almost 2 years. And then before that, President of Placemakers for the 20 years prior, working across North America and abroad to help communities build resilient, walkable, and inclusive places. So whether leading zoning reform or helping neighborhoods recover and reinvent, my work has always been grounded in the belief that placemaking isn't just technical, it's profoundly human. Across these roles, I've seen firsthand how misinformation and disinformation can undermine even the best laid plans. I've watched affordable housing proposals get labeled as threats to neighborhood character. I've seen bike lanes framed as an attack on local businesses, despite all evidence to the contrary. So these false narratives don't just slow down projects, they create divisions, erode trust, and turn neighbor against neighbor. Alongside these challenges, I've also seen what's possible when we choose communication over confrontation. When we do the biggest little thing that we have time, money, and political will to be able to do, build some trust, and then do the next biggest little thing. One of the most powerful antidotes to disinformation is deep listening. A recent example is our work with Winnipeg's Malls and Corridors suburban retrofit as part of the Government of Canada's Housing Accelerator Fund. Instead of rushing into solutions, we began with a series of roundtable discussions that brought together architects, city planners, housing advocates, developers, builders, nonprofits, elected officials, and community members. So before a single word of zoning was drafted, we sat together to listen. Really listen to understand concerns, aspirations, and priorities. We selected 9 sites across a range of contexts to demonstrate we were listening, creating concept plans to show how we could thoughtfully infill housing around job centers, retail hubs, and services. During a design week in studio, we sat down with landowners and revised the plans together in real time. It wasn't just about presenting ideas, it was about co-creating them. That process of shared ownership allowed us to draft a zoning bylaw that reflected common ground that we would not have found otherwise. The additional public information sessions that followed allowed us to refine the bylaw even further, incorporating community input. When the bylaw went to public hearing, it passed 15-1 after 3 days of thoughtful deliberation. And because of that heavy lifting, the hard conversations and the trust building that happened up front, it did not trigger just the 25 objections that would have otherwise sent it to the Manitoba Municipal Board. That's the power of proactive engagement. While misinformation and NIMBYism are real challenges, I've found that they can actually push us toward better practices. They compel us to be more transparent, more inclusive, and more deliberate in our communication. They remind us that people want to be heard, and that deep listening done early and often can create trust needed to move forward. And we're seeing that same commitment to collaboration and deep listening in the ongoing work with the city's green space and biodiversity master plan and bylaw, currently being co-developed with 6 regional Indigenous nations and groups. And I want to take a moment to thank many of the folks here today. Thank you, Laren, Laren, Colleen, and the whole team at the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources convening that co-development table. The care for greenways and blueways rooted in Indigenous knowledge and stewardship is helping give the community comfort. It's helping turn some of our NIMBYs, not necessarily into YIMBYs, but definitely into QUIMBYs, quality in my backyard. And that is a beautiful shift.
Thank you, Laren. I'd like to ask Laren Bill now. Please introduce yourself and your role and talk about misinformation or disinformation from your perspective, just at the high level. Thank you. Oh, Mike.
There we go. Currently, I'm the chairperson for, it's called the Implementation Monitoring Committee. It's the only alternative dispute resolution table in Canada that deals with treaty land entitlement. So I've been the chairperson of that table for the past 10 years, just being again reappointed on my 11th term. It's a binding agreement that was signed back in 1997 that deals with the implementation of treaty land entitlement here, specifically in Manitoba. So in regards to disinformation, it's very dangerous as it relates to TLE because it can often affect the process for lands being transferred to First Nations through the reserve creation process. Oftentimes, media portrays urban reserves as devaluing property, which is a clear attack on the treaty land entitlement process. People often don't realize that this TLA process dates back to the original date when the first treaty was signed in 1871. And so misinformation and disinformation is used to scare people, a tact that living beside First Nations is a bad thing. Thanks.
Thank you, Laren. And Rochelle Squires.
Much. My microphone's on? Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Rochelle Squires, and currently I am the CEO of Centreventure, which is a organization, a development corporation mandated with revitalizing Winnipeg's downtown. I stepped into this role in January and am delighted to be working in this capacity. I'm also a journalist and a columnist and have written extensively for the Winnipeg Free Press, among others publications. And I was also a member of a political party for 14 years, and I held elected office for 8 years. I served in the capacity as Minister of Sport, Culture, Heritage, Status of Women, Francophone Affairs, Sustainable Development, Municipal Relations, and then finally I ended my career in politics as the Minister of Families, and it left office in October of 2023. I would say primarily exhausted, disenfranchised, disillusioned, and disheartened about the state of disinformation and how it is really prevalent in our electoral process in our democracy. And so most of my comments today will be talking about that experience and what I witnessed and what I was a part of in the electoral process. And I also want to just say I'm here today in a nonpartisan capacity. When I left office, I relished the opportunity to jump back into ordinary society, if you will, and take off any kind of partisan hat, and have spent a lot of time looking at my own complicity involved in the democratic process and others, and have really, the opinions that I'm expressing today are just speaking from experience, but certainly not speaking from a partisan perspective. But before I get into that juicy stuff, I want to pivot just for one quick moment about information is a tool, and we've always used information as a tool. I look at my current role as CEO of Centreventure. One of my great challenges is to revitalize the downtown. And when I speak with people who either are considering living in the downtown or investing in the downtown or building in the downtown, what is one of the greatest detriments that you're facing, or what is one of the biggest obstacles? And of course, people automatically, first and foremost, say public safety. And so I see this as an opportunity to provide good information, factual information about the state of our downtown. And I think it's important that we have a fact-based conversation that is have all the bias and false perceptions eliminated from that conversation, so we can talk about what it means to come together as a city and support one another, standing shoulder to shoulder with all our local neighbors and our fellow citizens. And so information and working to put out information and recognizing information as a tool is not in and of itself a negative thing. What is negative is that when we use that tool and turn it into a weapon. And with the advent of social media, we've seen information be weaponized at a rate that I don't think any of us could have foreseen even 10 or 15 years ago. Even when I think about when I started to get involved in the political process, there were always these opportunities to use disinformation as a weapon against your opponent, but it was a slower method. You had to, get some sort of catalog or flyer. You had to go to Canada Post and get some postal codes and send it out through the mail, and it can be 2-3 weeks before your nefarious message got out there. And today, with a snap of a finger or a push of the button, it can be disseminated and reached. It can reach hundreds of thousands of people in a moment, which is frightening. And I've seen the political process utilize this as a tool to gain advantage. And politics, for anybody who's ever been involved in the political process or just been an interested citizen of democracy, you recognize that there's always two levels of campaigning that occur for all political parties. There's the primary tour, if you're in an electoral process, the primary tour of a political party putting out information about themselves. This is what we're going to do. This is what we've done. This is what we stand for. That sort of thing. And that's always, before, I would say, that was one of the primary methods of communication. That would be the primary message we would receive about when we're making our decision on who to vote for. And then there's always been this underlying secondary tour, if you will. And it's the tour, you rarely see the leaders engaged in this level of campaigning. It's perhaps some other members of the political party or the elected officials, or more recently, anonymous factions of that party putting out information that you don't even, when you first hear it or see it or come across the message, you don't even know where it's coming from. And you have to really look very closely to see, authorized by the PC Party of Manitoba or authorized by the Liberal Party of Canada or whoever, to know who owns that message. And then with this advent of these other interested democratic parties, and they have these creative names that they use disinformation as a count, and so you're receiving these bits of information, and you don't even know where they're coming from and which party is behind them. So I was really encouraged to hear about the minister's Bill 30. I think that is certainly something that is needed. It's been needed for a long time, and I'm eager to go back and read Paul's column. I admit I missed it, but I'm going to go back and read that column, learn more about that legislation, and definitely put my name towards supporting a bill in that manner, because we need to ensure that there's greater accountability and for in the political process to move forward in a better way. But I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Rochelle. So we're going to move on to a round of questions, just a couple of minutes each in the interests of time. We'll start with you, Rochelle, and I'm going to ask you about your personal experience in a moment. But first, when you talk about deliberate misinformation tactics, can you, in your experience as a cabinet minister, as an elected official, can they actually have an influence on outcomes or political direction and decision-making?
Oh, absolutely. And I can point to many, many different instances where I was surprised or caught off guard that there would be this consternation about an issue or an initiative that I was advancing, and disinformation coming at me about the very thing that I'm putting out there. And then likewise, areas where I was caught in the center, the nucleus of a misinformation campaign, and how disheartening it is. And you just realize you've got so many people who are believing something and you don't know if the facts have all been presented. And how to get those facts out there is always a real challenge. And I'm just going to pivot for a quick moment as to one of the things that political parties have done, governments have done in the last few decades that have really eroded this opportunity for elected individuals to get information out there, is what I call the concentration of power in the leader's office. And what that means is that the political leaders in government, whether it be the prime minister or the premiers, are exerting a lot more control, and they're employing a group of people around them called, their chief of staff or their press people that actually hold more power than the elected people within that government. Mm-hmm. And so the premier or the prime minister has this control, and they will instruct all of their members to adhere to this message. This is the message of the day. You don't talk about anything else. If your constituents want to talk about A, B, and C, but our message is X, Y, and Z, you're not to talk about this. You stay here. And we see this when we hear political candidates, people running for office, being told that they cannot enter into debate. And so what happens when you've got a political candidate who's asking you for your vote and they are not participating in debate, they're not speaking to journalists, there's a vacuum. And we all know nature abhors a vacuum. We need to have information. And if you're not going to be providing it, then people are just going to come to conclusions that may not be rooted in fact or may not be productive in what we would like in a healthy democracy. So I really do think, once again, it stems from this concentration of power that political parties and government leaders have exerted, and thwarting conversation between your elected officials and the citizens that are being asked to participate in democracy.
Thank you. Thank you. Laren, so you work in treaty land entitlement work, and I know from our conversations that the agreement that you referred to, the 1997 agreement, made a commitment to, correct me if I'm wrong, transfer 1.1 million acres of land, and I think the goal was within 15 years of the signing of that agreement. So can you explain to us how you see has misinformation or disinformation impacted achieving that goal?
Well, I've directly witnessed this process being very bureaucratic over the 17 years that I've been involved in treaty land entitlement. There's many steps to the process that require resolution prior to it, to the one parcel of land. It could be 1 acre of land, or it could be 1,000 acres of land. It doesn't matter what the size of. There's so many steps involved to get that land to be transferred back to the First Nations. So on average, it takes about 7 to 8 years for that one parcel of land to get transferred back to First Nations. Not to mention treaties, as I mentioned at the beginning, were signed in 1871. At the very start of the process, the government's got the wrong foot out of the gate when they first started this process. And so this disinformation and misinformation aspect that exists is that municipalities, as well as citizens, fear that their lands or property are going to be taken from them. And I wanted to clarify that First Nations cannot expropriate lands for TLE. It has to be based on a willing seller and a willing buyer agreement that is reached between the two parties. Or it is also chosen from Crown lands that are vacant lands that are able to be used to satisfy this TLE promise. So the TLE lands comprise of 1% of all of Manitoba. And there's often a fear that a lot more of this land is going to be taken up. But when you calculate all the acres and the amount of land mass in Manitoba, it only comprises of 1% of all of Manitoba, of these reserve lands that are outstanding. And all current reserve lands in Manitoba is just barely over 1%. When you combine that existing reserve lands with the outstanding TLE lands, it's just barely over 1%. So all current reserve lands are still in process. As Marilyn mentioned, this agreement was signed in 1997, and we are only 51% complete after 28 years. And so the total complete amount of acres is 1.1 million acres of land, and not to mention this process is very slow. And yes, the more disinformation that is shared on social media only creates more challenges for achieving this contractual commitment, this legal obligation of both the federal and provincial governments to achieve ultimately.
Thank you. I'd love to understand at some point what we don't have to talk about it now, but just misinformation and disinformation and how it veers into essentially racism, misunderstanding completely of the original obligations and the agreements that all governments have signed to try to move towards resolution of those original agreements. Maybe you can think about that for your next question. Hazel, you've had the opportunity to work on planning projects many places around the world. You have an international character you can bring to this conversation. I know you've worked in the Ukraine, done some interesting stuff in New Orleans, from Detroit to Winnipeg. Now you're here. It's a great gift to us that you're here working with us. And when you think of all the timeline of all those various projects you've worked on in all the various parts of the world, do you think they would have been able to be accomplished in the misinformation or disinformation world we live in now?
When I look back at those projects, I definitely wonder, certainly within the timeframes that we were able to achieve them, if they would be able to happen today. Back then, misinformation didn't spread at the speed or the scale that we see now. Today, a single misleading and viral post can circulate faster than any official communication, and the public narrative, before we've even had a chance to respond, starts to be set. So disinformation doesn't just slow things down, it actually reshapes the entire community engagement process. It forces staff and elected officials into very defensive postures, spending more time managing perception than advancing solutions. But experiences like those I was talking about earlier with the Winnipeg Malls and Corridors work definitely gives me hope. They show that by creating spaces for genuine dialogue, by taking the time to listen and understand, we can preempt some of that disinformation before it really takes hold. The by right zoning that we passed through that process didn't just streamline development, it also helped earn hundreds of millions of dollars in federal grants tied to housing and infrastructure and transit. And it also paved the way for ongoing work like the new zoning bylaw to support gentle density, allowing 2, 3, and 4 dwelling units per lot, and what are currently single and 2-family zones, provided that the infrastructure and minimum lot widths are there to support that infill. So that bylaw is currently making its way through public information sessions this week and next week, leading up to a public hearing scheduled for June 2. So that's still a pretty tight time frame, in large part because of the federal mandates that are required to hit those grants. So by embedding transparency and collaboration into the process, we are reducing the space for disinformation to thrive. It's not foolproof, but it's definitely powerful.
How long have you been with the city?
It'll be 2 years in July.
Have you seen misinformation slow down city planning yet?
For sure. We have to spend a lot more time and engagement than we would have in past initiatives, where you start to see, focused organizations that are producing misinformation and also asking their constituents to fund them.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your strategies for addressing that have been?
Communicate, listen.
That's why it's taking more time?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Hazel. Maybe we'll move on to Paul, just in a couple of minutes, Paul. We see misinformation and disinformation in the news daily. And during the last few weeks, the federal election, as you heard Tom Axworthy also comment on, many Canadians found themselves wading through many conflicting viewpoints. Are misinformation and disinformation tactics specific to any one level of government or any one political viewpoint?
No. Should I stop there? World Economic Forum just did a report last year which warned that disinformation is the greatest threat to healthy democracies, and more of the malign activity has been targeted at national governments than subnational governments. And at the national level, there were some good things being done. One of the things we need to do is understand the motivation and ways in which disinformation circulates. And the federal government created something called the Digital Citizens Initiative, which researched the sources and nature and remedies to some of these challenges we're facing. This area of concern overlaps with the problem of foreign interference in Canadian elections from both state and non-state actors. And we had a commission of inquiry led by Justice Hogue, who concluded that this was an existential threat to democracy. She said that it hadn't at this point had a big impact on election outcomes, but it's disruptive and it causes people to lose trust and confidence in the electoral process. That's something we have to deal with. I did work for the Elections Canada on that topic, and election management bodies around the world are not as highly regarded as Elections Canada, but even its reputation can be harmed if people, for their own short-term political advantage, attack it. And the last thing I wanted to say is that on this particular segment is we need stronger leadership and support and activity from the political parties. They have to do far more to be responsible in their behavior, to put in the policies and practices to deal with this phenomena. Leadership contests and nomination contests are the sleazy underbelly of partisan politics. Lots of terrible things go on there. And the other threat I'd mention just in passing is if people can hack into party data sets, our personal privacy is going to be sacrificed, and actors with malicious motivations can use that to target segments of the population. And we've seen that in reports where candidates have faced artificial campaigns intended to discredit them. So there's so much work to be done here.
So with that, I'd like to close the panel by asking one final question of each of you, looking forward into what can be done based on your personal experience. If there was one thing you would like the audience to take away from this in terms of action, local community action, etc., what would you like to share? We can start with you, Paul, if you're...
Okay. We need to be deeply concerned about the trends and developments that are underway. We also need to keep a perspective on it. I don't think we're, particularly in this society, Canadian society and Manitoba society, I don't think we're in a deep crisis at this point in time. So let's not overreact. I recall I've talked about a balanced approach when it comes to campaign periods and pre-campaign periods and so on. So we have to take the media, social media, stakeholders, citizens, and so on. If I had to come down to it, I'd join the minister in saying what we most need is education. Surprise, surprise, somebody spent 40 years of his life being an educator. So the required education begins at a very young age, and it's a lifetime journey. We all have to be more alert, engaged, alert, attentive, and be critical in our thinking in order to deal with this phenomena. It's going to be with us. It's going to probably get worse before it gets better.
So legislation's a good first step, but education is the next step. Okay, thanks, Paul. Hazel?
Final thoughts on combating disinformation. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is believing that disinformation only affects the folks who are heavily involved in social media. But the reality is those narratives definitely don't just stay online. They show up in council chambers, at public hearings, in letters and petitions. They influence how neighbors actually talk to each other and how elected officials weigh decisions and how policies get shaped or stalled. Disinformation is kind of like secondhand smoke. It drifts into every room, whether or not you're holding a cigarette. It's why it matters to all of us. But what gives me hope is that we're not powerless, like so many folks have mentioned here on this panel. We've seen through projects that we're all working on that proactive, transparent, inclusive communication can inoculate against the worst effects of misinformation by creating spaces for honest dialogue like you're doing right now, by showing that input leads to impact. We can build trust that makes our processes more resilient. And at the end of the day, the antidote to disinformation is not just more noise, it's deeper listening, clearer communication, and a commitment to staying at the table together even when the conversations are hard. And that's how we build not just agreement, but shared ownership in our future.
I guess to answer the question, I would offer two things. One would be to educate yourself on TLE. I mean, you could go to my website. It's tleimc.ca. Go to the source to ask those questions from the people that are directly involved in the work or topic that you want to learn more about. If something is causing you a concern or fear, I would suggest asking yourself, what am I afraid of? And how will this affect me? As well, educating others. Remember these facts and share them. First Nations do not require service agreements with municipalities to have TLE's land set apart as reserves. And two, money for TLE does not come from taxpayers. It comes from money held in trust by Canada. And number three, TLE selections do not prevent landowners from accessing their private lands or their leased lands. Thanks.
Thank you, Laren. 3 very tangible facts we can remember and share with others maybe. Yeah, Rochelle, thank you.
So representation matters. We need to see people in leadership that have integrity, that have lived experience, and come from all walks of life. And whether that be leadership in government, in leadership in media, finance, technology, we need to see a diverse leadership at the upper echelons of all these spheres of influence in our society. And unfortunately, what we have seen is with the advent of leaders from these communities becoming more prominent, particularly in the political world, where we're seeing the rise of diversity among our slate of candidates. We're also seeing the rise of social media. I got elected at the time of when social media was just taking off, and on my very first day of government, I was victimized heavily by a very specific targeted disinformation campaign that attacked me right at the core of my identity as a woman, and I was being shamed in a way that made me want to throw the covers over my head and never get out of bed again, as I had a whole swath of anonymous people saying that I had slept my way to the top and had gotten my job because I was a blonde woman and for no other reason than that. And I'll never forget that night when this disinformation campaign was underway, and I was reading these horrific messages about myself on Facebook, and my son walked into my room and he says, "Mom, do you know what they're saying about you?" And I slammed my laptop shut and I thought, I don't know how I'm going to carry on. And what mother wants to put her face out there, to put her best foot forward in taking on a leadership role when she knows that her kids are going to have to receive this information? And that is probably one of the hardest, most vulnerable things for women. I speak for women, but for anybody who is not from an establishment, to step forward into a leadership role and knowing that you might have to combat these very, very shameful messages about your identity that others will see. But we're not helpless. We can do something about this. And as somebody who read all of her letters from my constituents, from the people that I served, I can tell you firsthand that writing letters makes a difference. Write your MLA and say, "I support Bill 30. Write your member of parliament and say, "I want to see an Online Harms Act be reinstituted in this government immediately." And the last thing I'd like to say is also put your money where your mouth is. Support good journalism. Subscribe to Maclean's, subscribe to the Walrus, buy your Winnipeg Free Press, support local journalism, because if they go away, if they are no longer there to provide us with that fact-checked information that we rely on to make good decisions, we are going to be left in an abysmal state of disinformation. So those are my suggestions. Thank you.
Those are wonderful. Thank you. That's really great. So we cut the question period here, the dialogue here short, so that we could maintain 15 minutes of questions from the audience for you. So now's your chance to grill the panel if anybody would like to ask anything in particular of any of our panelists. Yeah, please go to the microphone. Thank you.
Hi there. I'd like to thank all of you for your perspectives and your viewpoints. It has been a fascinating discussion from minute one today, and I appreciate all of you. I'd like to direct this question to Paul, and I appreciate all of your perspectives. It's a very balanced view. I did write down one of your comments, which is, we're not in a crisis yet. And I'd just like to push back on that comment just a little bit in one specific instance, and that is that if we haven't noticed, we are in a deep, deep, deep climate crisis. And your comment was to not overreact. We are in the middle of a very, very incredible disinformation and propaganda campaign from the fossil fuel industry and from other related interest groups. And the crisis that we are in is way worse than the public discourse might reflect. You said we don't need legislation to stifle debate. We need education. I agree we need education, but I'd like you to unpack a little bit that comment about how legislation and regulation that could combat the kind of disinformation and that's coming out of those particular interest groups might stifle debate. Can you explain to us how that might happen and why we shouldn't be responding more energetically to that kind of activity?
I got the question. Your communication was clearer than my communication clearly. I circulated some misinformation. I was speaking specifically about the political domain and more specifically about the situation here in Manitoba, because I don't think at this juncture where we've seen such active use of AI-generated deep fakes. So this was the head of elections Manitoba, Shipra Verma, getting ahead of the trend, and the government going along with recommendations and following comparative legislation coming up in other jurisdictions. On the issues you cite, I'm fully on board. I said at a gig at the Lieutenant Governor's house a week or so ago that the two most morally compelling issues in my mind on the public agenda today are climate change and reconciliation. And so if there's any sense of importance, because not all things are as important as one another, and if there's anything that cries out for bold action, those are the two files that I would put at the top of the list. So I apologize for misleading you. I hope the mental fog will clear in your head as quickly as possible.
Yes.
Yes, I was reading the other day about the education of early 17th century intellectuals in England, people like Shakespeare, Milton, Thomas Hobbes. And part of that Renaissance education was that you be taught a rhetoric that enabled you to make contrary arguments for the same subject matter. It seems to me, I would like to think anyway, that there are facts and truth in the world, but there are also interpretations. And interpretations, we notice, vary. And of course, that's a good thing, because in a democracy, we have a pluralism of values. That's what a democracy is all about. And therefore, there are a variety of interpretations. Now, I think maybe this perspective leads us to sort of focus as well on the question of free speech. When we're thinking about establishing agencies of the state, or agencies that the state has some role in policing, how do we ensure that in policing the question of disinformation, that the state itself isn't infringing on questions of free speech and varieties of interpretation?
thinking that was aimed at me. And thank you, Professor Alan Mills, for asking a tough question. I'll identify you. You can't remain anonymous. I refuse to let that happen. And that's what I said at the beginning, that it's balanced. And so you could put prohibit outright deep fakes, and you'd run afoul of the charter. You couldn't get away with that. Many of the laws in the states end up in the courts, and we'll probably have a decade of battles in the courts as provinces and other jurisdictions adopt laws on misinformation and disinformation. We live in a more litigious society than ever before. And I agree that truth is not something that's out there to be identified and everyone will agree upon it. So we have to maintain a debate that is rigorous. I'm a big advocate of freedom of information, whistleblower protection, privacy laws. Those kinds of things go along with this, and they have to be strengthened. We're going backward on that, I think. Governments are more and more about controlling the message and protecting their image and reputation, and that's a real danger. And so we have to, how do we distinguish spin, the artificial representation of the record of a government, with disinformation, which is for a more malign purpose than winning the next election, you know. So it's not easy. The inquiry required for that and the debate over what it all means is very, very tricky. I don't have the answer, and there is no single answer. Let's be honest. There's not a single switch you can flip, you know. Anyways, I'll stop.
Thank you. A question Rochelle mentioned in her experience within the party system, being hit with messages that she as a candidate, even as a minister, didn't know about. The message supervision by the leader's office. And Paul and much of our discussion with the minister has been about the parties. And they're obviously a crucial part of this, as several of you have talked about. I want to raise an even more difficult issue, whether any of the panelists have an idea about this, and that is about political actors who aren't part of the party system. We're talking about an integrity office, Paul's idea, in the parties to say how they are adhering. But what do you do about Canada Proud or a whole bunch of other third-party organizations which are vicious, and the internet, when we're talking about the changes in politics, that in newspapers have editors. For many years, we have had judges to keep journalists and information accountable. There is none in the internet. It's the Wild West. And what can be done about third-party perpetrators of disinformation that are not part of the party system? The parties, I think, we know how to deal with. Hard, but we know how to deal with them. What do we do about the third-party actors who are springing up everywhere? Any ideas?
Well, that's a really tough question. I'm going to hand the microphone over to Paul in a second, but let me just say, one of the things that a principle that I've always operated under is that I always want to be able to, be influenced, to hold as much influence as I am being influenced. And when I am now being influenced more by my environment than I feel comfortable with, then it's time to leave the environment. And unfortunately, that was the message I had when I left office in 2023. I felt as though my individual contributions were no longer able to make up for the amount of influence that I was no longer being able to hold, and how much I personally was being influenced. And so it is an enormous challenge for anybody when they are looking at how to move forward in a leadership position or how to operate in an entity like a political party. And apart from at the municipal level, we have a party system at the political and federal level. And if you want to participate in a party and have a good chance of winning an election and serving your community and being a good ambassador of democracy, generally the path forward is to joining a political party. And then once you do that, you recognize that there's all this other associated debris with that political party. And lately we've seen these organized campaigns that have shown up in droves to whether it be influence public policy or planning purposes or how we organize as a society. And the way to combating some of that is combating disinformation always starts with information. And again, I come back to my same original messages that each and every one of us needs to be empowered with good information. That means supporting local journalism. That means being engaged with our elected officials and asking them to hold their responsibility as citizens of this democracy, as elected officials of democracy, responsible, and asking our elected officials not to just be purveyors of a leader's message or a political party's message, but to really hold that responsibility sacred as being an ambassador for of democracy and having sovereignty over your thought process. You get elected to serve your community, not to serve a broader political entity's message or goal, and always to maintain our role. If we cede our space as citizens in democracy to these nefarious activities of these other groups, then none of us have a shot. But together, I think we stand a chance at it.
We're giving the last word to Paul.
Oh, yeah.
You go ahead. No, yep.
It's such a hard and good question. I think that education and information is critically important. A few years ago, one of my former colleagues, Cade Benfield, and I started something called codescore.org, and it's the compendium of our 135 favorite, predominantly peer-reviewed studies that tie the payback to people, planet, and profit from placemaking and city planning initiatives. So, just constantly sharing that information, or also codesstudy.org, which looks at all of the zoning changes worldwide that comply with the Form-Based Code Institute criteria for enabling complete communities, and looking at the impacts of other places worldwide who've made the sorts of changes that governments are intending to make now and in the future, to say, here are the impacts in the other places. So just to flood the market with information, kind of, and then also so that at the global level, at the institutional educational level, but also then at the local level. So at the moment we're building on the 3D maps that Ryan Litovich here and the audience has built for Treaty 1, looking at the paybacks of property value per acre for those different sorts of regulatory constraints, and then drilling down into that for the city of Winnipeg for what that looks like for all of these different zoning changes, to say, all right, well, these different types of zoning have generated these types of values, so if we apply that to our own numbers, because right now we're spending so much money, more money per person than we did in the 1970s, because we keep on doing this dispersed city. So, and each of us are paying more for the linear feet of streets and sidewalks and water and sewer. And so in other cities that they say, oh yeah, you pay about a third to a half more for those dispersed development patterns than you do for those compact patterns, and about 10% more for services. That's just on the expense side before we ever get to the revenue side, which, downtown often generates 1,000 times more property tax per acre than, different formats. So really letting the community have the information that they need to make the choices for themselves, or the fact that we're approaching this demographic cliff at the moment where lots of folks are wanting to downsize, and the millennials and the future generations don't have the funds in order to purchase all these large houses. So how can we adaptively retrofit things to be more in keeping with today's market demand? So it's such a complex and multifaceted conversation, but just tapping into colleagues going through the same experiences and into our own data sets to ensure that we share a more granulated picture. And yes, you can still argue both sides of the same realities, but really understanding what those arguments are and grounding them in data is so essential. And that's, I waylaid the mic on the way to you, sir.
Fine. Just very quickly, Bill 30 has the appropriate language. It talks in terms of individuals and organizations who will be within the scope of the law, who will be targeted. But so that goes beyond political parties and candidates to include other types of entities like political action committees and interest groups who intervene in the election process and may be guilty of putting. They can be as vicious as any ads coming out of a party headquarters. I know that for a fact. The other point I was going to make is in the last decade, 200 newspapers in this country have disappeared. And we've seen the rise of fake news organizations. It was a terrible spectacle the other night after the leadership debate when the microphones were monopolized by Rebel News. They're not a legitimate news organization. I don't care what Ezra Levant says. They're not real journalists, and so that's a problem. And finally, I think my last point would be, I think governments have to be tougher on social media organizations. I know they're going to run into battles in the courts over free speech and all the rest of it, but we can't let money become a form of free expression. Spending money is not free speech. If you happen to have a lot of money, you can get a lot more money, I understand. It wasn't my experience in life, but I understand that's the way it works.
Well said, Paul. Thank you so much to all of the four panelists for such interesting personal anecdotes and advice.
We just wanted to say thank you so much for taking your time and for preparing. It was really a fascinating conversation. And I'm going to just hand you all a little gift. And there's a nice print from Bob Haverlook for each of you in the bags.
Well, good. And thanks to the panel again. We'll move on to our next part of the proceedings. Hopefully the technology works. Professor Heidi Tworek from UBC, who's the research chair, Canada Research Chair at UBC, and the director of the Centre for Democratic Institutions. She has appeared before Parliament on issues of foreign interference, and also on Sam's question. She's particularly headed up a group that's looking at disinformation around the environment. So Heidi really is the go. I've enjoyed her articles very much. She's one of the go-to people in academia on this issue of social media disinformation. So Heidi, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It seems the technology is working perfectly, so I'm going to share my screen and then we will get going. It's really a joy to be here, and I'm only sad that I am joining you virtually rather than in person. And I hope you have as beautiful weather as we do in Vancouver, where it's going to be up to 25 degrees Celsius today. So what I want to talk to you about today is to give you a little bit of a sense of some of the work that I have been doing on environment, and particularly environmental and climate dis and misinformation at the municipal and local level. So I think of this as a problem that's particularly pressing over the last few months or couple of years. The problem of climate change and misinformation on social media is longer standing. 4 years ago, some research by the Centre for Countering Digital Hate based in the UK found that Facebook was only labeling 8% of spurious posts around climate change. And here we're talking about things like calling climate change a scam, so unambiguously spurious when you look at them. Only 8% of them were being labeled as misinformation. But the fact was that this wasn't actually particularly widespread. This goes back to Paul's comment just now, because the Centre for Countering Digital Hate found that 69% of these misleading posts came from 10 what they called super polluter publishers of some kind. So these weren't necessarily widespread sentiments. 69% of them were coming from these 10 super polluter publishers. So what I want to do to you about today is to give you a sense of some of the dynamics of local climate misinformation within Canada. This is building on a report that just came out about 6 weeks ago from the centre that I direct, the Centre for the Study of Democratic Institutions, and that research was funded by the Digital Citizens Initiative out of the Heritage Ministry. I then want to talk a little bit about individual susceptibility and what we know about individual susceptibility to mis and disinformation, and finally to finish with some of the solutions that we suggest in our report to end with a real sense that there's actually a lot that we can do. There is no silver bullet. This is a long and historical problem. I have a PhD in history, so I guarantee you this has been a problem for at least 400 years since the invention of newspapers. But we have seen it wax and wane. We're in a waxing moment, so the solutions are trying to help us get into more of a waning moment. Okay, so first, why am I focusing, and why does our report focus on local climate misinformation? Well, we know that over 70% of greenhouse gas emissions are actually produced within cities. A lot of that, municipalities and local governments don't necessarily have that much latitude to deal with, but it does mean when we're thinking about climate change, cities or municipalities are really important. I was also part of a group that produced a more global report about disinformation in cities, and one strand of that was climate, and it's part of what inspired me to then go on and look at climate specifically in the context of Canada. So we know that local governments are really at the forefront of a lot of civic engagement, but when we look at the research, actually most of the impacts that are looked at are at the national or international level. But it's really crucial to understand what's going on at the local level. So we did focus groups and interviews, and we also did a lot of quantitative research looking at social media platforms to really narrow in on what was happening at the local and municipal level. So by local climate misinformation, what we were looking at was misleading information about climate science or national policies and programs, but also solutions and issues that were being discussed and proposed at the local level. So we talked about this more broadly, but also to get a really granular sense, we focused in on a couple of case studies. One of those was looking at Edmonton, Alberta, home to some wonderful nature. The runners-up in the 2024 Stanley Cup, but also the center of what became a quite massive international, quote-unquote, controversy around a 15-minute city proposal in 2021. So this was a proposal by the Edmonton City Council, that the city should try and re-gear so that people could reach everything that they wanted within a 15-minute walk. Now, there were very legitimate concerns about whether there would be vehicle use restriction, whether this would lead to gentrification in particular parts of Edmonton. But at the same time, there were overblown fears of what was called, quote unquote, climate tyranny, propositions that this was just the first step on the route to further lockdowns. Remember 2021, just still coming out of COVID lockdowns, and the assertion that this was purportedly being driven by quote unquote globalist forces. Now, this wasn't just a dialogue that was happening on social media Within Edmonton, it was picked up by Canadian Jordan Peterson, but also by anti-climate change groups like the UK-based Wide Awake Media. So something that seemed like a very particular discussion in Edmonton City Council actually became an internationally discussed issue with a lot of mis and disinformation around what was happening. A lot of it, as I've said, amplified by people not based in Edmonton, but rather outside of even Canada itself. This led to all sorts of interruptions and delays for Edmonton City Council, and the proposal was finally voted in 2024, actually, but it had to include some superfluous language about how this proposal was not going to violate the Charter in any way. So this is one of the examples we look at in our report in the ways in which local climate mis and disinformation really does affect policies and communities. And we found 6 main impacts. The first group of 3 impacts was on local policies and resources. These kinds of incidents eroded public trust, massively delayed or rolled back policies, and they also strained local resources that had to respond to, in some cases, a whole host of problematic content that was coming from outside of the locality itself. We then saw a bucket of community health and safety issues. So in some cases, these kinds of problems can increase safety threats in terms of who's showing up to council meetings, what they're doing as one example. But we also saw online harassment of local officials in different ways. It can raise public health risks. If we're slower in implementing some of these policies, it can obviously have effects on people's health. And finally, slowing adaptation to climate change because it simply takes longer to introduce policies, or they're in some cases not introduced at all, or indeed rolled back. In terms of the issues that were currently commonly targeted, we put them into 4 different buckets. One is the urban planning bucket, rezoning, 15-minute city plans, low emission zones, and so on. And we also look in the report at a couple of international examples like low emission zone within London. There's also the mobility and transport bucket, bike lanes, bus lanes, congestion pricing, diesel vehicle bans, EV incentives, public transit fleet electrification, etc. There's building policies, retrofits, energy use, construction materials, etc. And then finally, longer-term climate change adaptation, whether early warning systems, seawalls, or extreme weather preparedness. We also investigated how there are common motifs of disinformation, including deepfake images that will tend to crop up when there are wildfires and other kinds of disasters. And this also goes along with sometimes denying the ways in which climate change accelerates those incidents. We identified 7 main narratives that were used in misleading discourse around climate. These often mirror global and national narratives, a lot of which we talked about in addition to the city playbook, but we really find they are very much embedded in local socio-political. So there's these 7 core tactics used to make misleading claims about local climate action. First is exaggerating the costs, often only focusing on some short-term costs, not thinking about long-term gains, for example, or misrepresenting costs in general. Second is misrepresenting climate impacts. The third, exaggerating freedom concerns in some way, as in the Edmonton example. Fourth is greenwashing. The fifth is distorting climate solutions, misrepresenting how they function. Sixth is defending the status quo. And the seventh is delegitimizing or harassing those who are presenting these policies in some way. We find that there are really 2 main groups that are targeted by these forms of miscommunication. The first is elected officials themselves, whether through harassment, but also through certain forms of lobbying or social media. And the second is various forms of community members who are targeted in different ways and may have different levels of susceptibility to this misinformation. It's targeting towards low-income community members, but there's also targeting towards the affluent to push NIMBYism, for example, not in my backyardism, as well as targeting vulnerable communities too. So this leads us to this second part of the talk, which is really trying to unpack a little bit more what the research tells us about then individual susceptibility. So I've mentioned communities, but there's actually some really interesting research that is trying to tangle on a global scale, what are the kind of individual characteristics that make people more susceptible to online misinformation? So there's a study looking at 16 countries on 6 different continents and found there were 4 main reasons that people tended to be more susceptible to problematic information. First was they were relying on intuition. The second, that they failed to engage in analytical thinking, so they just took took it, it spoke to their underlying beliefs, and they didn't analyze further. The third was they had motivated reasoning in some way. So a classic example would be if I'm in the US and I'm a Democrat, and a policy that's actually a Republican policy is presented to me, but you say it's a policy from the Democrats, I think it's great. But if you presented it to me as a Republican policy, I would hate it, right? Or vice versa. So that's that's an example of motivated reasoning. And the fourth is that undervaluing democracy is actually a key reason for individual susceptibility. So I think there's some ways in which we can deal with these questions, but certainly that one around undervaluing democracy really speaks to how we need to think long term about discussing democracy and getting people engaged in democracy. So in terms of reliance on intuition, the other forms of research, for example, psychological experiments, show us there's actually a great deal we can do to try and get people to think and pause for that couple seconds longer and not just simply rely on their intuition. So one version of this is something called accuracy nudges. So what that means is you have something that you insert into social media interactions that makes people pause a little and ask them to think about whether this thing is accurate. So before Elon Musk took over Twitter, for example, Twitter had introduced an accuracy nudge where if you tried to share something that had a URL link, it asked you if you had actually read the article before you shared. And so that was just nudging people to think, well, am I just sharing this because I think the headline is good, or have I actually read it? And indications were this actually very much increased the accuracy of the information people were sharing. Problem, of course, this is relying on social media platforms doing this, which they have certainly moved away from over the last few months. When we're thinking about how to try to push people away from motivated reasoning, there are all sorts of digital literacy tips that we can potentially use. One is Mike Caulfield's method, which is a SIFT method, asking people to stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context, something we can use media literacy training to do. But the one that's hardest, as I've said, is figuring out how do we deal with people undervaluing democracy? What do we need to change within democracy to make people feel more invested? And what does that look like in the longer term? Something I'd love to discuss with you in questions, or perhaps something for you to continue to think about throughout this wonderful day. So let me finish before we open up for questions by discussing some of the solutions that we suggest in this report, in particular for thinking about local climate misinformation, but these are really applicable, I think, much more broadly around communications in general. So the first thing that we did is we built on a framework within the Disinformation in the City playbook, which really points to the fact that while we often think about the mis or disinformation moment, that's actually not really a very helpful way of thinking about it. We need to have a much broader framework that enables us to set up for timely interventions. So the Disinformation in the City playbook talks about a before, a during, and after an incident. And we add a further fourth category, which is really trying to think about long-term resilience. So having broader institutional and educational approaches, for example, in media literacy. But then making sure in the before, during, and after. The before, there's pre-bunking, early detection, and all sorts of measures set up in advance to try to prevent harassment, or in the case like what Rochelle was talking about, that there's actually really measures in place to help individuals who are experiencing that. We're not leaving them on their own. They have institutional support. That during any of these kinds of incidents, we already can do debunking and also community engagement to try to contain the spread. And finally, that afterwards, we don't just breathe a sigh of relief, that's all done, but actually we try to increase transparency, have recovery within our institutions, and also further support for individuals or communities who might need it. So in terms of our solutions, what we're really trying to think about is how do we build capacity for productive conversations? So of course the focus on mis and disinformation it makes sense in many ways, but what we often see is that mis and disinformation come in when we have an information or data void, which means that we don't actually have high quality information out there. We don't have good spaces for productive conversations, and then that creates a greater susceptibility to mis and disinformation. So instead what we recommend is thinking about building capacity for productive conversations, which can mean that vigorous and rigorous debate around issues, but it isn't something that verges into harassment, abuse, etc. So we suggest 5 recommended approaches, and I'll delve very quickly into each of them before we open up for questions. So we suggest that we need to think about messaging more broadly, collaborations, measurement, community engagement, and safety. So let me now delve into each one of those and just give you very briefly some examples from around the world and how each one of these is really functioning quite well. So the first, in terms of messaging, I've already talked about pre-bunking, debunking, etc. And that all sounds great, but it really works best when those conversations are culturally relevant, they're accessible to audiences, for example, in as many of the languages as people are comfortable speaking in the area that you're in, and that they're facilitated through trusted community members. Communications research really tells us it's so often not the what of communication, it's the who or the when or the how. We also need with messaging to actually ensure that the people have the media literacy to understand the messages that they're receiving. So in Helsinki, Finland, for example, school curricula very much embed media literacy. There are also specific media literacy weeks where students are taught to evaluate sources, identify manipulation tactics, and critically assess online content. We do have the NGO Civics here in Canada that does some of that through its Control F program. There's certainly more that can be done. Second, ensuring community engagement, which many local and municipal governments do anyway, but we can always consider how to continue to improve that through practicing more transparent dialogues, try and strengthen that democratic participation and local populations' information before some of these mis and disinformation moments crop up. So how do we get people more engaged in their local communities so they know more about it before they might encounter mis and disinformation about what local and municipal areas are doing? So for example, in Montego Bay, Jamaica, there's a Cities Forward program where city representatives sit down with citizen and community members to try to identify the potential barriers to implementation or financial gaps in the city. Thirdly, we see a lot of successful work in collaboration, both horizontally between cities and then vertically between different levels of government. These can help to strengthen partnerships across sectors and levels of government. So it really helps just optimize resource mobilization and coordination when you have one of these disinformation incidents. So we see this happen, for example, in Germany, in Dortmund, this New Orleans in the US. The American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees have coalitions of that ensure sustained knowledge sharing, pilot projects, and research time. So there's already trust that's been built in advance of any kind of difficult incident, which means it's just easier to mobilize in that moment. Fourthly, we need to really be able to measure to know what's going on. Sometimes seeing a few social media posts, it really feels like something is terrible, but how do we know if it's worse than before if we don't track the spread and impact of misleading information so that we can really use data to inform interventions, but also refine communication strategies. This may mean cooperating with universities or others, but it can just mean taking advantage of the tools that some universities have put out there. So for example, Toronto Metropolitan University has created a deepfake tracker research portal. So once you know about that, you can go to that tracker. You can use the learning tools there are for responding to misleading information, but also look and try and see how much of that stuff is actually out there and how is it changing over time. And really crucially, this goes along with a lot of the other work I've done about online harassment of political candidates, journalists, and health communicators. We just see how important it is to really think about the state of staff, whether it is civil servant staff or elected officials. It's really important for institutions to think in advance and develop institutional policies as to how we're going to protect staff in case of any kind of reputational, psychological, or indeed physical harassment. The good news here is there are lots and lots of field guides and manuals that are out there. For example, PEN America has created an online harassment field manual, which guides online users in navigating online abuse or improving their digital safety. And it's really important to do this before an incident. For example, making sure that people's addresses are not easily detectable online so they can't be doxed. Once you've been doxed, your address is out there, very difficult to deal with. But try to make sure that everybody doesn't, for example, have a publicly available Instagram where they've taken a picture of their house so someone can identify where they live. These are just important small pieces of training that can make a huge difference in preventing harassment that is online going into harassment that is offline. We work at CSDI on thinking through these kinds of issues, so very happy to consult with anyone who's trying to really think through what kind of institutional policies are feasible. So in sum, it's really important to think about the mis and disinformation portion of it, but what we find is there's actually a lot that we can do to try and prevent these kind of incidents from escalating. We need to build trust through increased capacity in different ways, recognizing constrained resources, But the aim here is really that we build information resilient communities. There is going to be mis and disinformation out there, skewed information, but how do we help people and communities be resilient in the face of those kinds of problems? And there, if you want to check out the report I've been talking about, you can go to tinyurl.com/municipal-matters. But I'm really looking forward to any of your questions, whether about this report or about mis and disinformation more broadly. Thank you so much.
Have any questions? If you do, maybe walk up to the microphone. We've got a couple of minutes. Heidi, are you good to stay with us for a few minutes for questions?
Of course.
Oh, Tom has a question.
Heidi, thank you for that. A lot of information in a very short time. Well done. My question is one that I have been asked before, and I've never given a very good answer. And particularly on the question of harassment with public servants or officials. And that is, when you are attacked unfairly, some unfortunates who that have happened to have come to me and say, how do I respond? Or should I respond? If I respond, will it make it bigger? Will it amplify it? Will more people hear these terrible accusations? And then the second part, if I should respond, is it just me? Who's going to help? My organization doesn't have anybody whose job it is to help us do with this. So I'd like you to comment on that. Is this a common problem on the harassment issue that you've emphasized so much?
Yeah, thank you. So unfortunately, it is quite common that institutions don't actually provide sufficient support, or they say some of this is our job, but not all of it. So for example, even universities might say, yes, you're on social media, but actually that's something we're asking you to do, but you have to deal with harassment by yourself. So this, I would say, is a common problem, but something we're trying to push for is getting institutions to actually set up policies to make very clear who you turn to in some of these crises. In some cases, institutions actually do have support, but it's really impossible to navigate, or it takes, a couple of weeks. And by that point, this incident has really escalated. So that's something I would say that I and also Jagras Hodson at Royal Roads and some other scholars are really trying to work on. We see really great examples, for example, in academia in places like the Netherlands or Austria, actually that some place sort of equivalents of Royal Society of Canada have a whole host of resources that they actually dedicate to helping scholars. We are starting to see other institutions, for example, in the realm of health, step up in this case as well. I would say when we're thinking about the individual's response, there's a couple of things. One is that you want to think about how widespread this actually is before you decide whether to respond or not. So in some cases, it can be very hurtful, but it may be that the spread is not so great that it's worth replying, because then you will inadvertently amplify. And that can be a little bit of a judgment call, right? So in some cases, you may decide it's really important to respond, even if it's just a couple of posts, because the accusation is so heinous that you really need to be on the record disputing it and showing that it's false in some way. In other cases, the judgment call might be it's better to let sleeping dogs lie, because your response will actually inadvertently amplify this. In other cases, what might be best is not for you to respond, but to see if your organization or someone else can respond on your behalf. That can be another mode. And then the other things that I would say is, even though social media platforms may not respond, it's still important to document, especially if it's something that goes against the terms of service of many of these platforms. Unfortunately, in many cases, what we see happen with this harassment is it's actually totally against the terms of service of these platforms, but those terms of service are not necessarily being enforced. So it's a huge burden on the individual to have to report this. If you have a team who can do it, that's also very helpful. The final thing that I would say, though, is a lot of our research on political candidates, for example, shows that part of the problem with all of this is, yes, that you can do all of the things that I'm saying, but it takes a lot of time away from your team doing the things that you want to be doing. Let's say in an election campaign, you want to be campaigning. You have the same number of resources as everyone else, but now you're spending a bunch of them dealing with online harassment instead of actually dealing with campaigning as you would like. So these are some of the sort of broader issues that people face.
Hello? Okay. Thank you for your fascinating presentation. There was one slide where you talked about individual susceptibility, and I was struck by the last bullet on that slide, which talked about undervaluing democracy. And it reminded me of a podcast I heard a couple of years ago about a study out of Penn State, the McCourtney Institute for Democracy, where they did a survey of Americans and found that 78% of Americans believe democracy is the best system of government, but 19% of Gen Zs and millennials actually indicated that a dictatorship would be good, potentially, and that has been backed up by an Economist poll in 2023, similar data. So I'm just wondering, we talk about attack on democracy like it's a bad thing, but maybe we need to figure out how to get at that core conversation, because it sounds like a big chunk of our society doesn't actually, and the young people don't agree with that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. It's just such an important question, because too often we just focus on the content of the information rather than the broader reason why there might be receptiveness to it. And sometimes it's less about the individual piece of information and more about people's general unhappiness with democracy, which can have many causes that go beyond our information ecosystem. So what I think this speaks to several things. One is really trying to understand where that dissatisfaction comes from. The second is trying to really address it. And the third is understanding that much of addressing that has very little to do with the information ecosystem, but maybe things like housing, affordability, climate change, etc.
Hi there. Thank you for speaking with us today. I really enjoyed your slide on solutions, a framework for timely interventions, where you talked about the before, during, and after type of solutions. The before aspect of that, so pre-bunking and early detection warnings, I would think that tapping into the talents of the private sector and of the NGO sector would be instrumental to that. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about how we can tap into that talent, whether that's something that the government should facilitate, and if so, like, would that be like a reciprocal benefit type system, or how do we do that?
Yeah, thank you. So in a way, there are a couple of examples, at least, of how the government is trying to support that. So the Digital Citizens Initiative, which supported our research into this report, also supports a whole host of civil society organizations who are thinking about media literacy, disinformation, and so on. And that's really helpful because a lot of them are really embedded in particular communities or thinking about, for example, youth. So to just expand on that example of civics. So civics does a couple of things that are really, I think, helpful in terms of also answering that question around democracy. So they run a student vote program where students can then mock vote during elections, can be provincial elections, federal elections, etc. Because we know that the main way that people decide to vote in another election is if they voted in one before. So getting students to practice before they're even eligible to vote is a really wonderful way of trying to engage them in democracy and democratic conversations. And one of the things that civics has been doing is the Control F program that is thinking about digital literacy. So trying to have pre-bunking, bring in academics like me and others who are talking about how you're actually going to do pre-bunking, etc. So that's just one, I think, really helpful example in how different civil society groups can do this well. I'll give you one more example, which is Science Up First, which was created during the pandemic with the idea that you really need high quality information about science produced accessibly on social media as a really key way of trying to combat a lot of the anti-vaxxer and other content that was out there. But the idea was to have an organization where this was fact-checked by scientists, but it wasn't necessarily putting individual scientists in the position of having to disseminate this information. That initiative continues, has had millions and millions of views on social media, but also cooperates with community groups to have that material translated in linguistically and culturally appropriate fashions. And then I think we have other examples during the pandemic where there were groups that sprung up to try to provide information that were often supported by private industry as well. So we've got some really interesting examples. The question is, as you say, what's the right mode of government support or partnership? Sometimes it works best when there isn't as much government support or partnership, because that can sometimes be seen as delegitimizing. So I think having a whole range of different modes of civil society and private industry engagement is what's really crucial.
John Dewick from CMU here. It's so nice to have you here, and this was a really, really engaging talk. When you talk about, at the end, you begin to move into solutions, and you talk about creating space for productive conversations, and you characterize what's happening there as an information void. And the remedies that you have for the various kinds of behavior have to do with information, like accuracy nudges, right, or digital literacy. But I'm wondering, as someone interested in this as a kind of rhetorical problem, right, and the word community, or I think about Hazel Borys talking about deep listening. I wonder if you could also characterize what's happening here as a relationship void. And I wonder if you were to do that or think about it in the situations that you've been working on, what insights or inferences might you make?
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of talking about it, because too often when we talk in the space, you're right, we talk about the provision of information, but sometimes actually what's really crucial is that listening. I was kind of hinting to that in the answer about democracy, is that some of this is actually really about listening to what people are saying, but also in some case, even deeper listening to the things that they aren't saying or the values that are underlying what they are talking about. So I'm thinking in the case of the US, sociologist Ali Hochschild has talked about the idea of people's deep stories. So the stories they tell themselves about the world, which is how they interpret everything that is then happening. And there she's talking about mainly working class white people who interpret what is happening in the US, things like affirmative action as queue jumping, for example. And so they grow to resent this because they think that people are jumping the queue. So then they interpret many stories about what is happening on the basis of their deep stories. So that's where I think your idea about relationship is actually another really helpful way of framing this, because it helps us see, can't just be, sage on the stage, putting information out there. Some people will hear it, but whether they're actually going to listen and absorb it is really a very different question that has to do with their deep stories about the world, and whether this aligns or not with their value system. So that motivated reasoning question. So I think any way that we can think about this as more reciprocal, where it involves listening as well as speaking, engagement in some way is really helpful. And relationship is another useful concept in that mode.
Well, Heidi, that's brilliant, and thank you so much for enlightening us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to head into lunch, and before we do, and before we end the live streaming portion of today, there'll be workshops during the lunch to get into more detail on the issues that Heidi has talked about. But before we do, as I have mentioned, Massey College asked for a paper to be comparative paper to be written on this subject, and to conclude our live streaming portion, David, I would like you to both introduce yourself, and you've been here with us all day asking questions. Think about what you've heard today and perhaps just highlight some of the main areas of your paper that you think might apply. So thank you for your work, and thank you for coming from Toronto. David is a colleague from the Monk School at the University of Toronto.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Tom, and thank you all for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. As Tom mentioned, I'm from the Monk School. I'm a second-year master's student at the European and Eurasian Studies program. And today has been amazing. Disinformation is undeniably a multifaceted and pressing issue in the Canadian context. It is also undeniable, as we heard from the second panel, that marginalized social groups are disproportionately impacted by this problem. So it is clear from this discussion that resilience building should be the focus of Canada in combating disinformation. And resilience is a tricky term, but we can broadly understand it as the ability of a social group to withstand disruption, whether it's security or informational in nature. So from a governance standpoint, I think it's important to note that the federal government as well as provinces, as well as municipalities, all play a central role in combating disinformation and in supporting civil society to identify and report this stuff. So the fight against disinformation extends beyond social media. As Matt Wiebe rightly pointed out, many people can continue to consume disinformation on social media in spite of the news organizations not being allowed to post there. But the discussion extends beyond, the four horsemen of the social media apocalypse. When we're talking about this stuff, it's also important to talk about the Canadian information ecosystem as a whole, and that includes very large online search platforms which are increasingly using artificial intelligence, and as well as chatbots like ChatGPT. So from the discussion this morning, it's clear that Canadian society needs that whole of society approach to resilience building that we've been talking about. It's also clear that Canada needs to have a system that imposes costs on the platforms that are facilitating this disinformation, and a system for imposing costs on the actors that are pushing the disinformation themselves. So, in other words, resilience to disinformation requires a whole of society approach. And as Tom mentioned, a link to my working draft will be provided with you and shared with you. But in this report, I essentially highlight that Canada is not alone in this struggle. Our southern ally, the United States, has largely withdrawn from the fight against disinformation, but there is lots Canada can learn from its allies, as Tworek has highlighted as well. So in my report, I look at the experiences of the European Union, I look at Finland, I look at Estonia, Sweden, Norway, and as well as Ukraine and Taiwan and Australia. And the importance of relationship of government and civil society is very different in these countries, and I think that's important to stress. But in spite of these differences, there's lots of learning potential from these countries to be applied in the Canadian context. So these countries have also been addressing disinformation much longer in Canada. I think that's an important thing to note. When you look at the literature and stuff, it's well documented that this is a trend that sort of started in 2015, and it sort of evolved throughout the 2016 as well as 2020 U.S. elections, and then of course with the trucker protest and COVID-19, and more recently again with the most recent U.S. election, and then our own election here in Canada. So in my report, I essentially I review these issues and I look at these different countries, and through Chatham House rule interviews, which are rules, interviews with rules of non-attribution. I'm also doing a scoping review of NG reports as well as academic literature. And I conclude by proposing 15 recommendations to the Canadian federal government, Canada's provinces, as well as Canadian municipalities. I don't have time to go over all 15 with you today, and I realize that I'm the last thing standing between you and lunch, But I thought I would conclude by highlighting my top three, and all three of them echo essentially what we've been discussing today. So the first one is to establish a nonpartisan independent task force, and this is modeled on the Ukrainian and Taiwan example. So why independent? It needs to be this way so that it is free of partisan bias. As we've highlighted, this is a nonpartisan issue, and it must have a clear mandate to lead a coordinated whole of society approach to resilience that we've been talking about. Paul Thomas and Heidi Tworek both mentioned the Digital Citizen Initiative, and I had the opportunity to speak with the individual, or one of the Canadian Armed Forces individuals who takes care of assessing these applications. And the initiative is great, but this officer also highlighted to me that the organizations working through the DCI, they work largely independent of each other. So that's something that this task force could do, is unite this effort and, push the agenda of a whole society approach forward. And again, it's important that this thing be independent so that it can't be used as a tool for censorship. Another idea that I have for imposing costs on the very large online platforms and the very large search engines is to look at the Digital Services Act, which is an act proposed by the European Union a few years ago. And what this act does is essentially it protects the privacy of the users of these platforms, but it also imposes a cost on these platforms for spreading disinformation. So that is a very useful avenue, and one potential way that this could work is if we conduct a legislative review of this document, see what works and what does not work in the Canadian context. Another potential option is to see if we can maybe join this agreement. But this remains a topic to be explored. And the third recommendation that I have is very much echoing all of the speakers today, which is education. And this is not just in the classroom, but also for civil servants. In the classroom, it is extremely important. The Finnish example, as Tworek mentioned in her presentation, is an excellent model. They have embedded media literacy not only as a standalone course, but embedded across their curriculum. So, they'll have a unit on disinformation in their history class to see how information narratives about history are manipulative, or they'll have a section in their math class to see how stats are manipulated. So something like this is extremely important. And from the civil servant perspective, it's really crucial that people working for our municipalities, as well as the province, and very importantly at the federal level, very important that they all know how disinformation can be harmful. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, David. And I'm going to just ask Colleen, our co-organizer of the day, to come up, who has some brief admin points to make as we break for lunch. One of the themes, I think, of this morning that we should think about, because we're going to work together this afternoon, is the phrase is attributed to Churchill, though almost every phrase is attributed to Churchill. But the phrase is that lies can spread in a minute around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. So this afternoon, we're going to see if we can lace up and have the truth at least be competitive with the lies. Okay, Colleen?
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you, David. That was excellent, and I'm looking forward to reading your report. Thank you for your work on that. I just want to thank everybody for participating today, and Cheryl for having us to your beautiful library, absolutely gorgeous facility. Thank you for being so generous with your space, and all of the incredible folks at CMU that helped us here today. I just want to thank you all, and of course to our amazing panelists and speakers. It's been an amazing morning. While we're having lunch, we're going to break for lunch. There's lunch at the back, so everyone just help yourselves. We're probably going to break for about 35 minutes or so. But when we come back, Cheryl Mathis from Honest Agency, one of the organizers, is an amazing communicator. She has a long, deep history in dealing with misinformation and the ability to help organizations really beef up their communications to start to get ready for these types of to combat these attacks, as we talked about today. So Honest Agency, Cheryl is one of the leads at Honest Agency, and she's got an amazing presentation that's going to really open us up for a discussion about what are the things we need to do. And I was really pleased to see how much it aligns with what Heidi was talking about as well, Cheryl. So thank you for taking the time to make that for us for this afternoon. And while we're having lunch, one more quick thing. We're going to have some Slido questions. And so there'll be a slide that goes up that explains to you how to put Slido on your phone. And what we're going to do is just do some anonymous polling for this little group here, just to kind of answer a few questions. The first being, have you experienced this disinformation either personally or within an organization that you're close to, or someone that you know that has experienced it? Do you feel vulnerable to this type of information out there and you know, some of this misleading facts? Are you ready? And then what are our policy suggestions? So we're going to do a little bit of an online poll just to kind of see if there's some consistent themes that run through this room, which will be really exciting. And then when we come back, Cheryl's got a fantastic presentation. We're going to have a great conversation, and what we're hoping is a lot of the input you provide to us will really inform some of the work that David's doing and others here today. So I will not go on any farther because we've got a wonderful lunch at the back. So please, everyone, help yourself. And again, thank you to everyone for coming out. It's really important to have everybody's voice on this issue today. So thank you very much and enjoy your lunch.